Good morning. The committee will come to order, and I note a quorum is present. We are here to consider the committee budget views and estimates for fiscal year 2024 as required by the Congressional Budget Act and in compliance with House rules. Each member has been provided a copy of the material on our agenda today. So once again, good morning, everyone. I call to order the business meeting to consider the Agriculture Committee Fiscal Year 2024 Budget Views and Estimates letter. Before we get into the letter, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to two returning members of the House Committee on Agriculture, Congressman Mike Bost of Illinois and Congressman Sanford Bishop of Georgia. We're thrilled to have both you gentlemen back with us, and we're very glad to have you here. The letter before you is a product of a joint effort with Ranking Member Scott, which articulates how a farm bill can alleviate the need for costly and inefficient emergency and ad hoc spending and promote economic growth. I won't gloss over the facts. Our country's financial situation is bleak. $31 trillion in debt and rising. And this is a very real cause of concern that should be addressed clear-eyed and with future generations in mind. I recognize and appreciate the enormity of the task ahead for my Budget Committee colleagues. They have to craft a proposal that strives for economic growth and fiscal balance. There is an adage in healthcare that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and I think that applies to our work leading up to a Farm Bill reauthorization. If done correctly, we can get away from this cycle of ad hoc aid and instead implement pro-growth policies across all the titles of the Farm Bill, and will ultimately reduce America's debt to gross domestic product ratio. To put the baseline of the Farm Bill in perspective, all mandatory spending within it constitutes less than 2% of all federal spending. When you drill down further, the farm safety net, commodity programs, and crop insurance combined make up just 0.2% of all federal spending. The return on this investment is incredible when you consider that there's 43 million jobs and over $7 trillion in economic activity attributed to the food and agriculture sector. This is the lens through which I'll be viewing all titles of the Farm Bill, asking what is the return on investment and where can we make fiscally responsible, common sense investments that improve the overall well-being of all our citizens, especially those living in rural America. Now, I think the letter under consideration today lays out that case and sets us on the path to crafting an on-time, effective, and bipartisan 2023 Farm Bill, and I urge its swift adoption. I would now like to recognize my good friend, brother in Christ, Ranking Member Scott, for any remarks that he would like to make.
Yes, thank you, Chairman, and you're absolutely right. We're definitely brothers in Christ. Thank you. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to have worked with the Chairman in drafting this letter, and we worked hard to highlight the issues facing agriculture and rural America in our comments to the Budget Committee. And I'm excited to take on the Farm Bill together and hope to continue to engage in the traditional Agriculture Committee bipartisan manner that serves all of our American people. Just as our farmers have been impacted by rising input costs, our SNAP recipients have similarly been affected by inflation and the increased cost of food associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the war in Iraq and the avian bird flu killing our poultry flocks. If ever there was a demonstrated value of the SNAP program, it is now. And I'm grateful for the administration's implementation of the science-based Thrifty Food Plan that ensures that Americans enrolled in SNAP can afford healthy, nutritious food, and ease the burden of inflation on our SNAP recipients. We continue to be impressed by the impact SNAP has in each of our members' congressional district, which returns an estimated $1.50 to the national economy for every dollar spent during economic downturns. Our rural economies especially see the value of this program, which directly increases rural employment and economic output. SNAP is a vital role of the survival of our great nation. My dear friend, Chairman Thompson, I think we agree that farm families across the country need support from us in the Farm Bill. We need to ensure our safety net functions effectively and that American farmers are not pushed out of business by disasters, low prices, high input costs, consolidation, or unfair markets. I hope to specifically provide additional support to our small cattle farmers and ranchers. As the New York Times recently reported, they are in a devastating situation. We have been losing an average of 17,000 small family rancher farmers every year. And for many years, thousands of them have not turned a profit. This is why we need to respond and help our small family ranchers. And I hope in this process to specifically provide additional support with legislation that is targeted to help our small family farmers, to give them the boost up they need and deserve. And I look forward to it being done in a very good, traditional, bipartisan way. We have other segments of the agriculture industry that will also be asking for additional funding to address their priorities, and I hope that our colleagues on the Budget Committee will take note of our specific requests and give us the level of funding we need to write this Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is singularly one of the most important and significant bills that we deal with, and one that has one of the highest amounts of funding in all of the funding that we do in Congress. Mr. Chairman, I want you to know that I'm honored to work with you on these important issues, and I yield back my time.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and it's certainly mutual.
Yes, sir.
I now recognizing the ranking member for a motion.
I move that the committee approve the letter regarding its views and estimates so that it may be forwarded to the Budget Committee.
Thank you, sir. That is a debatable motion. Does any member wish to be recognized to discuss the letter? All right, seeing none. Hearing no further discussion, the question is on the motion offered by the gentleman from Georgia to approve the letter. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed signify by saying no. That sounds pretty convincing to me.
Yeah.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the letter is approved. Does any member wish to file any supplemental, minority, or additional views to the letter that will be transmitted to the Budget Committee?
Oh, in the opinion, I'm sorry. In the opinion of the chair, Where were we here? I'm good.
Okay.
Got lost in my pages.
Mr. McGovern, you seek to be recognized?
No, I think some of us will submit additional views regarding SNAP, and
Yes.
yeah, we will follow up with you in a timely fashion. Thanks.
Very good.
Mr. Chairman,
Yep, Ms. Costa.
and to the ranking member, I think we share some agreement and Mr. McGovern and I will chat about the SNAP program, but there's some other programs in there that I've got companion legislations on that I would like to make reference to, like the market access program and some of the others that I would like to make sure that is on record.
Very good. Well, members may submit such views to the council's office, room 1407, by Monday, March 13th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time.
Thank you.
Thank you. With the consideration of our budget views and estimates letter complete, the committee will now proceed to our hearing today entitled Rising Risks, Managing Volatility in Global Commodity Derivatives Markets. After brief opening remarks, members will receive testimony from our witnesses today, and then the hearing will be open to questions. So with that, I call this hearing to order on behalf of the House Committee on Agriculture. Over the past several years, we've seen unexpected events that have shocked global commodity markets. The COVID-19 related shutdowns and Russia's invasion of Ukraine have each caused significant global disruptions to the supply and the demand of commodities. We're fortunate our derivatives markets showed resiliency throughout these events. There is perhaps no greater testament to the importance of well-regulated, professional, and liquid derivatives markets than their continued operation during times of significant market stress. Yet, the strength of our derivatives markets should not be taken for granted. Building deep, liquid, and safe derivative markets is a result of informed trade-offs and negotiated compromises between the needs of different market participants. It takes constant work to uncover, understand, and manage the risks that can develop. Widespread clearing is one reason for the success of our derivatives market, despite the recent turmoil. Clearing provides access to essential risk management tools for hedgers and creates a safe financial system for all Americans. Our cleared market performs so well due to the public servants and the professionals who work every day to understand and manage market risks, both at the Commodities Future Trading Commission and across the derivatives industry, including our 5 witnesses here today. Clearing manages risk by spreading it through multiple layers of market participants, recalibrating risk levels daily, and putting money aside in the form of initial margin and default fund. This system is well understood and has proven resilient time and time again. But after all that work, residual risks remain. One risk is the timely cash margin payments demanded by the clearing system will not be made on time or in full. This risk is remote, but also expected. There is no way to completely eliminate risk from derivatives markets, only ways to better manage it. As clearing continues to grow in size and importance, the needs of this committee to better understand its value and its mechanics, especially under times of extreme stress, grows too. Now, I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today. Each of them is an expert in cleared markets, and I'm looking forward to hearing the discussion today. And with that, I'd like to once again welcome the distinguished ranking member, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, for any opening remarks he would like to give.
Yes, thank you, Chairman Thompson, for convening this very important and timely hearing today, Rising Risk, Managing Volatility in Global Commodity Derivatives Markets. Very important. We're dealing with an $800 trillion piece of the world's economy here. Global commodity, excuse me. Global commodities markets help consumers and producers manage price risk and protect them from exposure to global events, such as a time as this. The past several years have been rife with uncertainty and volatility that has tested the strength and resiliency of our derivatives markets. This uncertainty and volatility has been driven by unexpected global challenges, such as the devastating and ungodly Russian war in Ukraine and the COVID-19 pandemic. These events have disrupted global trade and the transportation of food, fuel, and fertilizer, creating supply shortages and price fluctuations. This is the arena in which we have to deal now with derivatives. Now, as we examine the reactions of our global commodity derivatives markets to these major events, it's very important that we also take the time to focus on other sources of volatility and uncertainty that have emerged in recent years and will continue in the years ahead, such as an increase in the occurrence of extreme weather events, cybersecurity concerns, and the growth of fintech, and the preeminent impact of Russia producing nearly 66% of the ammonium nitrate that we need to produce our own fertilizer. This is a very critical issue, to have this kind of power over fertilizer concentration in the hands of Russia. And we are moving expeditiously with our own agriculture system to put in encouragements and support funding so we can produce our own fertilizer and not have to depend on Russia or anybody else. These concerns and challenges have presented new tests for our agriculture markets, from historically low water levels that have cut river traffic in the Mississippi River Basin to reduced access to critical crop inputs and energy as a result of global trade restrictions and interruptions. For example, wheat prices have experienced historic swings due to the disruption caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and fears of a global wheat shortage. And that is the other reason, because when you put Russia and Ukraine together, they produce a gigantic amount of the world's wheat also. Ensuring the orderly operation of our derivatives markets and preserving their role as a tool for price discovery and crisis management is of most importance now more than ever. And finally, I want to note that this year marks 10 years since the expiration of the Commodities Futures Trading Commission's reauthorization. I chaired this committee, this subcommittee, and time after time have tried to put through legislation to reauthorize. And when we had the threat from the European Union of wanting to take over from the CFTC their authority to operate in Europe as the source because Congress has failed to reauthorize the CFTC. Let's get it done this time. I worked closely with our Republican colleagues to pass reauthorization, and I appreciate that it is a bipartisan effort to get this done. And I know that Chairman Thompson agrees with me, and we need to reauthorize the CFTC, and that is one of my major priorities. The testimony of each of you and our distinguished witnesses here today will be very critical for our committee to guarantee that the CFTC has all the necessary and appropriate tools to ensure the integrity, the resilience, and the vibrancy of the U.S. derivatives market. And I look forward to hearing from this distinguished panel. I've met several of them and had a brief conversation with them before we started. And they are here to share their expertise, their knowledge of the state of our commodity derivatives markets, and the effectiveness of our existing tools for risk management. I yield back and deeply apologize for my cold.
No need to apologize for what we can't control. And I thank the gentleman, and I share your commitment. In addition to obviously an on-time, good bipartisan farm bill, we need to get the CFTC reauthorized. Share that priority with you. The chair would request that other members submit their opening statements for the record so that the witnesses may begin their testimony and to ensure that there's ample time for questions. Our first witness today is Mr. Michael Gelchi, the Group Chief Executive Officer of the Louis Dreyfus Company. Our next witness will be Mr. Derek Salmon, Senior Managing Director, Global Head of Commodities, Options, and International Markets for the CME Group. Our third witness today will be Ms. Alicia Crichton, the Chair of the Board of the Futures Industry Association. Our fourth witness today will be Mr. Christopher Edmonds, the Chief Development Officer of the Intercontinental Exchange. And our fifth and final witness today is the Honorable Dan Berkowitz, who is a former commissioner of the Commodities Future Trading Corporation, or Commission. Thank you to all of our impressive witnesses for joining us today. We're now going to proceed to your testimony. You'll each have 5 minutes. The timer in front of you will count down to 0, at which time I'll may give a little bit of a tap and a reminder to wrap up whatever thought that you're on, so that we have lots of time for questions. I assure you your written testimony has been circulated. All members of the committee have that in front of them, and your efforts at that were greatly appreciated. So with that, Mr. Gauchi, please begin when you're ready.
Sure. Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee, thank you for holding this hearing on topics relevant to global market risks for agricultural commodities. I'm honored to have the opportunity to contribute my testimony and appreciate your attention to these acutely important matters in the context of the extreme market volatility we have seen in recent years. My name is Mike Gelchi. I serve as Group Chief Executive Officer for Louis Dreyfus Company. We are a 172-year-old agribusiness active in over 100 countries with approximately 17,000 employees worldwide, including more than 1,000 right here in the United States. Our North American headquarters is in Wilton, Connecticut. LDC is a leading merchant and processor of agricultural goods. We absorb and manage risks on our customers' collective behalf, provide liquidity to all value chain participants, and execute logistics services to deliver essential commodities domestically and globally in a safe, timely, and reliable manner. We are proud to fulfill these roles, the effective execution of which acts as a shock absorber by both buyers and sellers along the food and agricultural value chain, ultimately contributing to competitive agriculture in the United States, which is particularly important in today's volatile and challenging markets. With regards to global market volatility, I feel compelled to give a broad response that recognizes the significant macroeconomic and geopolitical factors that have, in our opinion, been the primary contributors to contemporary market volatility. I will do my best to summarize our observations. Since 2018, agriculture in the United States has ridden a roller coaster of macroeconomic and geopolitical market impacts and challenges. These started with trade tensions between the United States and China, followed by acute and unprecedented supply chain disruptions as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, global stagflation and resulting currency crises around the world are negatively impacting the availability of U.S. dollar currency reserves required to execute contractual obligations that govern agricultural trade. Additionally, over 10% of the world's calories are held in uncertain availability due to the Russian-Ukraine crisis. Each of these topics individually warrants the attention of this committee, and while I have mentioned them expeditiously, I hope that each member and guest here today will consider the depth and magnitude of their influence on all aspects of global agri-commodity markets. Like many other participants in the agricultural sector, LDC relies on derivatives markets to hedge risk of the underlying cash commodity. It is important to acknowledge the value that speculative traders provide by injecting liquidity into derivatives markets. Many are also quick to blame speculative traders in times of volatility. However, we feel strongly that the recent volatility in agri-commodity markets is primarily due to the various risks and uncertainties facing the agricultural sector, some of which I have already mentioned. I would also be remiss not to take this opportunity to applaud this committee's collective work and oversight of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. The hierarchy of jurisdiction from your committee to the Commission to the self-policing efforts of commodity exchanges and the National Futures Association brings a level of market certainty that we depend upon to accurately hedge our significant risks and continue to serve both producers and consumers of agricultural products. The system has shown remarkable resilience in the face of extraordinary pressure and has created the gold standard for risk management around the world. Your leadership and that of the CFTC is critical to maintaining these benchmarks in the United States, where users like us benefit from clear rules and proper market oversight without stifling innovation and development. Maintaining liquid, agile, and well-functioning markets will allow the U.S. to continue leading in risk management. Mr. Chairman, I've intentionally kept these comments at a high altitude to provide an overview of the matters addressed by this hearing, and I look forward to responding to your questions, and I'm prepared to give more granular analysis during our dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Scotia. It's much appreciated. Mr. Salmon, please begin when you're ready with 5 minutes.
Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee, I'm Derek Salmon, Senior Managing Director and Global Head of Commodities, Options, and International Markets for CME Group, the world's leading and most diverse derivatives marketplace. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Commodities derivatives markets are essential to both consumers and producers to help manage price risk and hedge exposures to rising input costs. America's agricultural and energy producers and end users compete on a global level and are affected by trade policy, geopolitics, and weather events that can cause demand shocks and supply disruptions. These events directly impact prices for commodities, which are linked to real economies in the U.S. and worldwide, therefore impacting Main Street consumers. To combat these global uncertainties, commodities market participants need tools to deal with instability that creates unwanted price risk. U.S. derivatives markets provide market participants with a robust and well-regulated venue to efficiently hedge price risk, effectively discover prices, and powerfully mitigate unwanted counterparty risk. Derivatives exchanges like those at CME Group allow both commodity producers and end users to lock in future prices, providing predictability of both input and output costs. Over the last 3 years, we've seen significant disruptions to global commodities markets. While the war in Ukraine created supply shocks and markets like wheat and crude oil, the global pandemic similarly created significant demand shifts in energy markets, all of which created record levels of volatility across commodities. Thanks to the well-functioning and well-regulated derivatives markets that this committee oversees, U.S. and global market participants were able to accurately determine prices of core commodities and manage risk with minimal disruptions during these unprecedented events. Let me provide 3 examples of how these markets and their risk controls and financial safeguards functioned effectively over the past year, focusing on markets for wheat, energy, and metals. Before the war, Russia and Ukraine contributed roughly 25% of total global wheat exports. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, wheat prices increased 70% from their January 2022 levels. CME Group's clearinghouse followed transparent margin practices, which helped our markets to operate smoothly during this volatile period. The ability to adapt margin requirements is an important risk management tool that helps our clearinghouse assess overall risk portfolio risk to protect market participants. In March 2022, we saw the largest daily price move in wheat, triggering a price limit in our wheat futures, one of the pre-trade risk controls used by CME Group to maintain an orderly market. We promptly worked with the CFTC to get expedited approval to increase price limits and later to implement a dynamic price limit mechanism in the wheat market that allows the price limit to adjust with volatility and restore trading more quickly. These actions, respectively, allowed market participants to effectively manage risk and discover prices as markets normalized and will prepare the market for future events. Turning to the crude oil market, the story is largely the same. Trading in energy spiked as the war in Ukraine broke out. As with wheat, prices in our West Texas Intermediate, or WTI, crude oil contract, a global benchmark for the price of oil, increased over 60%. This is the largest upside move in over 10 years, but thanks to our market risk controls and the clear, predictable margin practices employed by CME Group's clearinghouse, market participants were able to effectively hedge, and our markets accurately reflected the price of this core commodity. Lastly, the invasion of Ukraine constrained Russia's ability to trade, which was felt by players across the metals supply chain in markets like aluminum and nickel. In addition, China, the world's largest consumer of many industrial metals, continued a zero-COVID policy that led to fears of significant demand destruction. By early March of 2022, new all-time highs were observed in the nickel market, contributing to an unprecedented disruption in the trading of nickel at one of the world's largest metals exchanges in London. Independent reviews of that disruption have specifically noted the absence of market oversight and risk management procedures such as those routinely deployed by CME Group's exchange and clearinghouse, including, for example, position limits, assessing concentration risk, liquidity-based margin add-ons, and daily price bands. CME Group's clearinghouse provides sophisticated financial safeguards and risk management and has a long history of successfully handling extreme market events. CME Clearing was well prepared for the commodities market events that began last March, making multiple proactive margin increases leading up to Russia's invasion in Ukraine so that customers would be prepared for market changes as volatility grew. In conclusion, as CME Group's CEO, Terry Duffy, recently wrote in a Financial Times op-ed piece, quote, "With near constant market challenges ahead, effective risk management will be crucial to navigate this new age of uncertainty. U.S. derivatives market, as regulated by the CFTC and overseen by this committee, are essential to ensure the global market participants can continue to manage those risks confidently and securely." Thank you for inviting me today, and I look forward to taking questions you may have.
Mr. Salmon, thank you so much for your testimony. Now I'm pleased to recognize Ms. Crichton. Please begin your testimony whenever you're ready.
Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. It's an honor to be here. My name is Alicia Crichton. I'm head of the clearing and co-head of the futures businesses for Goldman Sachs. I'm testifying today as chair of the Futures Industry Association, the FIA, which is the leading global trade organization for the futures, options, and centrally cleared derivatives markets. During periods of increased market volatility, including the pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, futures markets take on additional importance as a critical risk management tool for agriculture and energy end users. Markets function well, but our experience also underscored ways in which we can strengthen the resilience of the cleared derivatives markets. Today, I'll explain the role of clearing members in helping end users manage risk. Then I'll discuss margin as a foundational component of clearinghouse risk management, also commonly referred to as CCPs. Lastly, I'll briefly touch on diversity and inclusion in the industry, an issue that's personally important. Through connectivity to exchanges and CCPs around the world, clearing members provide end users access to global markets to manage risk. We are intermediaries and stand between an end user and the CCP and act as the first and last line of defense for the cleared ecosystem. As the first line of defense, we underwrite the risk of a client's portfolio before it ever reaches the CCP and monitor it on an ongoing basis. This includes determining suitability of leveraged products, monitoring clients for money laundering and other risks to market integrity, collecting and safeguarding customer margin, and guaranteeing the performance of clients to CCPs. Perhaps less known is that clearing members are also the last line of defense. We contribute substantially all of the financial resources that backstop the CCP in the event of a major market disruption or default. For CFTC-regulated clearinghouses alone, clearing members contribute close to $50 billion in default funds. The volume of transactions flowing through clearinghouses globally has increased significantly in the last decade, in large part due to post-financial crisis clearing mandates. While this has a positive and risk-reducing effect for markets, it also increases the systemic relevance of central clearinghouses and the market's exposure to them. Clearing members, end users, and investors must rely on the strength of a clearinghouse's risk management, and ensuring the regulatory and risk management framework for CCPs is keeping pace with their role in the market is essential. For example, margin is the primary tool available to clearinghouses to manage credit risk and the first layer of resources that they can access in the event of a default. Following the market volatility that stemmed from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we saw dramatic margin increases by CCPs across futures contracts globally. To meet margin calls, end users need high-quality liquid assets, driving up demand, and at the same time, scarcity of those assets. This can intensify market turmoil, cause a spillover into other markets, and potentially create systemic risk. European energy companies sought liquidity support from central banks and governments to ensure they could maintain their hedges and meet their margin calls. While margin requirements for listed futures contracts should increase during volatile periods and decrease when markets normalize, the magnitude of the increases signaled that margin levels had fallen too low. Improving the transparency of CCP margin models and the opportunity for market participants to provide input to the clearinghouse will help clearing members and end users be better prepared for periods of volatility. The CFTC proposed enhanced clearinghouse governance rules last year, an outcome of market participants and clearinghouses working together through the Market Risk Advisory Committee. In addition, margin floors designed to ensure baseline levels remain appropriately calibrated and more stable through time will help to dampen these extreme swings in margin. Clearing members provide substantially all of the resources available to a CCP to manage a default, but there is a layer of capital contributed by the CCP itself. The skin in the game is essential to align the incentives between a clearinghouse and its members for effective risk management, including the adequacy of margin requirements. Some progress is being made globally, and the FIA looks forward to continuing to work with regulators and clearinghouses to advance these discussions. As the first female chair of the board in FIA's 68-year history, I can attest that we're making progress in enhancing diversity in our industry. The face of our industry is changing, and we don't have to look any further than the CFTC and the historic confirmation of 4 female commissioners last year. There's clearly more we need to do, and I'm happy to discuss this further. Again, it's an honor to be with you today and to work with this committee as you consider these important issues. Thank you.
Ms. Crichton, thank you, and thank you so much for your testimony. Now I'm pleased to recognize Mr. Edmonds. Please begin when you're ready.
Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Scott, members of the committee, I am Chris Edmonds, Chief Development Officer for Intercontinental Exchange, or ICE. I appreciate the opportunity to be here before you today as this committee looks at the global commodity market volatility and the impacts on central clearing and margin. Clearinghouses play a critical role in the financial markets that serves the needs of participants around the globe. Policymakers across the world, including this committee, have an interest in safe and efficient markets. And commercial market participants rely on ICE's exchanges and clearing services to assess price risk, find market opportunities, and transact with confidence. ICE has a successful and innovative history of clearing exchange-traded and OTC derivatives across a spectrum of asset classes, including energy, agriculture, and financial products. Today, ICE owns and operates 6 geographically diverse clearinghouses that serve markets and customers across North America, Europe, and Asia. The risk-reducing benefits of central clearing have long been recognized by users of exchange-traded derivatives, you know as futures, and the performance of the clearing model throughout the even most challenging financial situations made it the foundation of financial reforms. As part of the increased use of clearinghouses and market participants have worked to make the clearing process robust and resilient, supported by suitable financial risk management and operational resources. The combination of market events in 2022 have been unique. The uneven and unpredictable reopening of global economies following the COVID-19 pandemic, the Russian invasion of Ukraine significantly reconfigured global energy supply. Rising inflation and subsequent central bank tightening of monetary policy and increasing political and investor pressure around energy markets, energy security, affordability, and sustainability. These events have impacted the financial and commodity markets and have combined to create significant uncertainty, high levels of volatility, and high energy prices at a time where the cost of capital has also increased. Despite the challenges related to these events, derivative markets have again proven to be resilient, liquid, and well-functioning, and continue to provide transparent price discovery. As a result of market events, volatility increased and market participants faced increased liquidity demands, including risk-based initial and variation margin calls. Market participants made these margin calls, or paid their bill, or received margin payments, or were paid what they were owed. The fact these parties paid their margin calls is further evidence the markets operated as expected, and market participants confidently relied on ICE's markets to manage their risk. ICE recognizes the volatile situation occurring in the energy markets and its subsequent impact on consumers. We also acknowledge the responsibility governments have to combat inflationary natural gas prices and supply concerns for their citizens. ICE, however, does not support the recent imposition of a market correction mechanism in the European Union and believes it will fail to achieve its primary objective of lowering energy prices and could distort the trading of EU natural gas derivatives. The market correction mechanism incentivizes market participants to use less transparent over-the-counter hedging tools or refrain from hedging, which could have a detrimental impact on liquidity and market confidence, resulting in long-term damage to the functioning and competitiveness of the global natural gas market. Clearinghouses collect and manage billions of dollars in customer funds pledged as collateral against derivative positions, including margin posted by commercial hedgers and farmers. The amount of collateral posted to clearinghouses has substantially increased due to the recent market volatility. Accordingly, expanding clearinghouse access to central bank deposit accounts for client margin is an important systemic risk mitigation tool and a means to protect client funds held by clearinghouses and ensure liquidity of these funds during stress market conditions. For this reason, ICE, along with other non-systemically designated central counterparties, support legislation providing central counterparties registered with the CFTC and the SEC access to deposit accounts offered by the Federal Reserve, as it is the safest and most liquid place to hold U.S. dollar client funds, and ask this committee to assist in advancing such legislation. You have in the past. We look forward to continuing to work closely with governments and regulators at home and abroad to address evolving challenges and to expand the use of demonstrably beneficial clearing services underpinning the best and safest marketplaces possible. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to share our views with you. I'd be happy to answer any questions you and the members may have.
Mr. Edmonds, thank you so much for your testimony. Much appreciated. And now I'm pleased to recognize the former Commissioner, Mr. Berkowitz. Please begin when you're ready.
Chair Thompson, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. I offer you my perspective on the recent volatility in the commodity derivative markets after having spent the past 20-plus years in various regulatory, oversight, and private sector capacities related to these markets. My appearance before you today is in my own personal capacity. I am not representing or speaking on behalf of any other person, governmental agency, or private sector entity. I'm particularly pleased to be appearing again before this committee. The Agriculture Committee's oversight of, guidance to, and support for the Commodity Futures Trading Commission has been critical to the CFTC's ability to fulfill its mission to ensure that commodity derivative markets operate in a fair and secure manner to discover prices and manage commodity price risks. Commodity markets and the associated commodity derivative markets have experienced extraordinary volatility in recent years. Increasing demands for commodities as the U.S. and other economies recover from the shutdowns caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, monetary tightening by central banks, China COVID policies, and extreme weather all have contributed to this volatility. This price volatility has caused financial hardships across many sectors of the economy, including the agricultural sector, as well as for the American families and households who will ultimately pay the bill for higher commodity prices. In addition to the carefully constructed derivatives contracts that are traded on commodity derivatives exchanges, these exchanges have a variety of tools to help ensure market prices and volatility reflect the true forces of supply and demand, and that market activity does not present systemic risks. Margin levels, speculative position limits, daily price limits, and trading halts can help ensure that prices are not caused by artificial means, such as manipulation, fraud, or other disruptive trading practices, that market participants have a sufficient opportunity to respond to changing market conditions, and that counterparties will not default. None of these tools, however, can insulate market participants from price changes due to the basic forces of supply and demand, and each must be carefully calibrated so that they accomplish their intended purpose of limiting excessive speculation, ensuring orderly trading, and avoiding systemic risks, while also not unnecessarily impairing the basic price discovery or risk management functions of the markets as prices change rapidly to reflect changes in supply and demand. The mission of the CFTC is to ensure the integrity of the commodity derivative markets, prevent manipulation, avoid systemic risks, protect market participants from fraud and other abuses, and promote innovation and fair competition among market participants and markets. CFTC regulations establish the basic requirements for margin, position limits, and orderly trading. The CFTC conducts market surveillance to ensure that trading is fair, orderly, and not subject to manipulation or other artificial disruptions, and brings enforcement actions for violations of its regulations and the Commodity Exchange Act. The CFTC must vigorously pursue its surveillance and enforcement responsibilities to ensure the integrity of these markets and maintain public confidence in the markets it regulates. Generally, the types of risks affecting commodity prices in recent years are not unique. Political disputes, general economic fluctuations, disease, war, transportation disruptions, and extreme weather have affected commodity markets and indeed mankind throughout history. However, severe weather events are increasing in unprecedented intensity and frequency. There is substantial evidence that climate-related risks now pose a recurring existential threat to many households, businesses, and communities, and threaten the stability of financial markets. It is prudent, therefore, that we improve our tools to manage such risks in the commodity derivative markets. This work includes the development and use of new risk management products and markets, increased disclosures regarding climate-related risks, and vigorous oversight of these products and markets by the CFTC to ensure the integrity of new markets and products. The CFTC has begun this important work with the assistance of public input, and I look forward to the progress of the agency and market participants in this area. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Well, Mr. Berkovich, thank you so much for your testimony, and thank you to all of you for your testimony today. At this time, members will be recognized for questions in order of seniority. alternating between majority, minority members, and in order of arrival for those who joined us after the hearing convened. You'll be recognized for 5 minutes each in order to allow us to get to as many questions as possible. And so given our, so far, as we start out the 118th Congress, outstanding participation, and I want to continue to encourage that on both sides of the aisle. I will try to be prompt with letting you know when the 5 minutes are done. So with that, I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes. Let me start by thanking our witnesses again, and we really appreciate you all being here. I know you all have busy schedules, but what an impressive panel that we've gathered today. We have a lot of new members this year, and I recognize that this is a very complex topic. So I'm going to use my time to try to level set a bit before we dive deeper into the substance of the hearing with additional questions from the members. Mr. Gauci, in your testimony, you mentioned the hierarchy of oversight in the derivatives market, and I can't reiterate it enough that this concept is so important for market integrity. The layers of responsibilities, risk management, incentives, and oversight are essential to understanding how this industry protects the market and participants within the market. So, my question is, and it'll be for each of you, hopefully we can get some comments from each. Could each of you briefly describe your role in the marketplace and, importantly, how you interact with each other, from market participant to FCM to the exchange to the clearinghouse to regulators? And Mr. Gauci, we'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Louis Dreyfus's role in the market is essentially a commodity merchant. We essentially buy from the farmer, sell to the end user. Through that, we use financial derivatives to hedge those risks. We trade in a multitude of commodities across the agricultural spectrum. And from that perspective, we use what I would say the financial derivatives both on the long, short side, as well as down the curve, if you will. Most agricultural futures markets have long-dated futures positions, and in effect, we act as that intermediary or shock absorber, as I mentioned earlier on, where a producer may be looking to sell a given commodity at a specific period in time, perhaps much further out in time, and a user or consumer may be looking to buy a specific commodity at a different point in time. So we essentially bridge that gap. To that extent, we will, as I mentioned, use commodity futures. Those ultimately get cleared by the FCM that we ultimately give the derivatives up to, and essentially that is what we do in brief.
Very good. Ms. Salmon.
So as a vertically integrated model, that owner of a clearinghouse as well as our 4 underlying exchanges, we provide, as I mentioned in my written and oral testimony, platforms and products for customers to trade. Now, we service all customers, the entire ecosystem, from producers, end users, farmers, ranchers, all the way through to financial intermediaries like Louis Dreyfus, like large E&P folks in the energy space, all the way through to financial players that are looking to gain access to different asset classes, whether hedge funds, asset managers, pension funds, long-only funds, et cetera, all the way through to retail. So our mission and purpose is to provide price transparency and price discovery mechanisms in lit electronic markets 23.5 hours a day, so that as global risk travels, risk mitigation travels with customers as well. We also engage with folks across the table here at multiple levels. FIA is an industry body that brings all interested participants together. We don't always agree on everything, but it's a forum to work out those disagreements, and that's okay. We have constant client communication. We're constantly engaged via our sales force to understand what's driving them and what they need. We have a number of client advisory forums where we bring customers in to hear what's challenging them, what's difficult to them. And finally, as it relates to Mr. Berkowitz's previous role as a commissioner in the CFTC, we participate in all of the CFTC's advisory committees that also brings together stakeholders across the industry. So lots and ways in which we engage, serve, understand the needs of different constituents in our market.
Very good. I don't have much time left, but Ms. Crichton, love to have you respond.
Sure. Just briefly, I guess the best way to describe the role of the FCM is we stand in between firms like Louis Dreyfus and Mr. Gelchi, his peers, other types of financial institutions. We stand in between them, exchanges and clearinghouses. We do that not only for CFTC-regulated clearinghouses, but for clearinghouses and exchanges globally.
Very good. Thank you very much. My time has expired. Pleased to recognize our ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Berkowitz, let me start with you. In your testimony, you mentioned severe weather events occurring with unprecedented intensity and frequency, and the need to update the tools of the CFTC to manage such risks. Last June, the CFTC issued a request for information, an RFI, to solicit public input on climate-related financial risks. So, Mr. Berkowitz, as a previous sponsor of the CFTC's Energy and Environmental Markets Advisory Committee, during your tenure as commissioner, are there any specific actions, updates to risk management tools, or market surveillance that you would like to see come out of this process?
Thank you, Ranking Member Scott, for the question. Yes, as you mentioned, during my service, my term at the CFTC, I had the privilege of sponsoring the Energy and Environmental Markets Advisory Committee, and in 2021, just a couple years ago, indeed, we had an advisory committee meeting that the other witnesses at this table have mentioned that the CFTC has advisory committees which are composed of a wide diversity of market participants, academics, and other persons familiar with the commodity markets, examining the topic, as you mentioned, new products and markets to deal with climate-related risks. And we heard some testimony at that, or some presentations. It wasn't testimony, it was presentations by the advisory committee members. I think Mr. Salmon participated in that, by the exchanges, a variety of exchanges and markets as to the products they're developing. So that was very encouraging development. New products don't always take on immediately. Sometimes they take a while for the market to see the wisdom of the products or the need for the products, but it's, I was very encouraged that there's active engagement by the exchanges and by market participants to develop these products and markets. So I find that encouraging, and I'm looking forward to the CFTC's analysis of the request for information in terms of what market participants are suggesting and offering. And I would say the other thing I think is very important is the increased disclosures of risk, so that people are aware of where the impacts of weather-related events might be and things like that, so they can take proper, so that these tools that are developed they can use, or the existing tools as well.
And to the rest of the panel, as I noted earlier, this year is 10 years since the expiration of the last CFTC reauthorization legislation. Can each of you discuss the impacts that you have seen or experienced as a result of Congress's inability to get together and pass the reauthorization legislation, specifically as it relates to the effectiveness of the industry's risk and management tools. And as I mentioned to you, the European Union used this as a weapon to take away the authority of the CFTC in our cross-border negotiations. And with the help and the combined help of our Republican chairman at that time, Mike Conaway, and Colin Peterson, my good friend Austin Scott, and Chairman Thompson, we stopped it. But they're still using it. What is the impact of our failure here in Congress to reauthorize the CFTC? Please, any of you.
I'll take a shot at that, Ranking Member Scott, and I'll tell a little story about you. I have the opportunity to oversee 6 clearinghouses, and not all of them are in the U.S., and one of the other regulators once pulled me aside, went across the pond, and said, we don't have Congressman David Scott who's willing to stand up and say what he did about what others maybe see as opportunistic opportunity to impact legislation and the certainty that provides. I think the short way to answer your question is the lack of certainty, and we all deal in a level of certainty, whether it's Mr. Gelchi wants to know exactly what it's going to cost him to put a hedge on, my competitor and Mr. Salmon wanting to make sure he knows what we're doing under the regulations so he can compete, and I do the same thing. Our members, represented by Ms. Crichton, we all look for certainty. That's what is expected of us, and if you can't provide it within the regulatory means that we have, it becomes more difficult to explain exactly the behavior you're going to receive or observe at exactly the highest moment of stress in the marketplace.
Thank you very much. My time has expired, but as Chairman Thompson said, we're working together here. We've got to get this done. It is an international issue now and an international embarrassment for us here in Congress, and I appreciate working with you on this, Chair.
Absolutely. I thank the gentleman. The ranking member asked an incredibly important question, and your input on why making sure we have the continuity, the reauthorization of CFTC, your thoughts and inputs on that. I think we would really welcome that, and I would just ask the witnesses that didn't get an opportunity to respond if you do that in writing for us, because this is a task that we need to complete, and having your input would be very helpful. Now we're recognize the another former chairman and the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson, for holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing before the committee. The U.S. banking regulators are in the initial phases of proposed changes to bank capital requirements. And as I raised to the Federal Reserve Chairman Powell yesterday during his testimony before the Financial Services Committee, I'm concerned that this could increase the cost of hedging to end users. Ms. Crittenden, could you discuss potential adverse consequences to reducing access to these products, particularly during periods of financial uncertainty? If we make it harder to hedge, what's going to happen when things get tough?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think it's a topic we think about certainly within the firm and across the membership of FIA, and I think really across the panelists sitting at this table. When we think about the impact of bank capital on clearing members, one of the first topics that comes to mind is the amount of capacity that we're able to provide in the system. When we engage with clients, when we work with clients, and we think about providing access to global markets, there's typically there's a few lenses that we'll think about and analyze their portfolio. The first is from an exchange margin perspective. The second is from a risk perspective, and the third is from a bank capital perspective. One of those three will ultimately define the amount of capacity that we give. The more punitive that bank capital becomes, the harder it is for us to be willing to stand in and continue to provide that capacity. So we do urge policymakers going forward, as capital rules are considered and reconsidered, to not continue to increase bank capital because it will further impact banks in providing the amount of capacity that they do.
thinking about my colleagues' comments, as we've seen over the past several years, it's essential for U.S. customers to be able to hedge risk on a global basis. Again, Ms. Crittenden, could you discuss the importance of cross-border access for U.S. customers, particularly as it relates to non-U.S. swap markets?
Sure, and thank you again for that question. I think, as I mentioned in my opening statements as well, part of what we do as a clearing member and other clearing members that are members of FIA is provide access to clients globally. And when we think about the importance of U.S. clients, CFTC, and U.S. regulated markets, our role is to facilitate access to those markets and access from U.S. clients to global markets. In addition, we also sit in the role of providing access to global clients into U.S. markets. So it's very interconnected, and it's also critically important to be able to facilitate clients trading across the globe to facilitate what their risk management needs are.
The swaps market faces a tremendous technical challenge as we transition away from LIBOR. Mr. Salmon, could you broadly discuss CME's conversion plan for LIBOR swaps? How big of an undertaking is this going to be?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Congressman. This is has been a huge undertaking for CME Group, as you know. Your IBOR, or the LIBOR that has underpinned the short-term U.S. dollar market in U.S. dollars on our market, have been around for over 40 years. Now, that has had to move to a secured overnight funding rate, or SOFR, market. We've been working with the industry since 2015. We've been a member of the Fed's ARC, the Alternative Rate Reference Committee, since 2015, with all the stakeholders in determining where and at what point does this mechanism need to move away from LIBOR-based into SOFR-based. We've been a member of the CFTC's MRAC, Interest Rate Subcommittee, since 2018. It has been a massive undertaking. We have had to work with all stakeholders, central banks, and all participants, from vendors, clearing firms, all the way through to other exchanges. To the extent that this was a heavy lift that we've undertaken over the last 5 years, we've actually almost completely converted everything in our short-term interest rate complex from LIBOR-based over to SOFR-based over the last 8 months. We are almost complete with that. The balance of our euro-dollar that hasn't yet already converted to SOFR in our market will convert on April 1st, and the balance of the swaps that haven't converted will be converted over on April 15th as well. This is not something that's happened in the last 6 to 12 months. This has been a 7 to 8 year process of working with all industry participants. I'm happy to say that our term SOFR licenses now total over 2,200 firms in 88 countries are now licensing term SOFR. There's over 6,000 loans with a face value of $3.5 trillion tied to CME SOFR. That's according to Refinitiv deal screen data. And if you look at the amount of open interest that has transitioned inside of our exchange and clearinghouse, almost 90% of that is now complete. So job converted, and certainly the final transition phase we're in right now. So relatively smooth, thanks to those on the FAA and the CFTC to help us get that done.
Thank you for those insights. Now I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Now I'm pleased to recognize the gentlelady from Ohio, Congresswoman Brown, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Scott, for holding this hearing today. And thank you to our panel of witnesses for being here. The financial markets in our country have been turbulent and unpredictable in recent years. From the COVID-19 pandemic to Putin's war on Ukraine, commodity markets have taken a hit. As of late, it appears that the only predictable thing about our markets is that they will be unpredictable. So I would love to hear from anyone on the panel, because yesterday I met with the Ohio Farm Bureau, and they expressed concerns about mandatory climate incentives tied to crop insurance. So while we may face restrictions in predicting global pandemics or certain natural disasters, to what extent can markets prepare for those events to improve resilience?
So maybe I'll take a first crack at that. Since agriculture is a huge part of what we do, it's also the history of CME Group going back 170 years now. We have the physical agricultural markets in our blood. It's the lifeblood of what we do. The focal point is that rancher-farmer family that has exposure to crop risk. We have been in the business of effectively providing deep, liquid, globally traded derivatives markets in markets like corn, wheat, and beans. The U.S. under CFTC jurisdiction jurisdiction, runs the world's largest grains markets on CME Group exchanges. Those are providing critical access to end users or co-ops to manage their risk. We saw, as Ranking Member Scott mentioned before, we saw the moves in wheat this year alone, not to mention soybeans have been extreme both up and back down. So our goal is to continue to create as much liquid, deep market access to all consumers, and firms like Louis Dreyfus and others in that space are critical intermediaries for providing the tools to manage that risk and exposure. That's important for everybody, whether you're in the wholesale futures markets or not. Customers that find themselves able to access these markets are able to manage that price risk, and that gets handed down to the eventual end consumer. This hits Main Street America 100%. So our goal is to continue to provide as much access in our liquid grains markets and ag markets, whether it's cheese, livestock, dairy products, or grains and oilseeds, to create as much access to price certainty through derivatives, and that's our core mission for end users.
All right. Thank you for that. Dodd-Frank was passed over 10 years ago, and we've had time to understand what worked well and what could use improvement to make our financial systems stronger and more resilient. Ms. Crichton, is it Crichton or Crichton? I want to make sure I'm saying it correctly.
Crichton.
Okay, all right. Ms. Crichton, looking ahead, what should we be thinking about over the next 10 years to make our system more durable?
Thank you for the question. We do think some of the benefits of Dodd-Frank have certainly been reduced risk in the markets and greater transparency. We also think the systemic importance of clearinghouses has dramatically increased given the amount of products that have moved to clearing and the amount that are continuing to be contemplated to be moved to clearing. So we think there are a couple of things that we can focus on as the markets continue to evolve. One is continued transparency from a clearinghouse perspective on margin models. And we think better calibration of margin, particularly focused on commodities markets. If we look at what's happened over the course of the last few years, we can go back as far as Brexit or certainly through the pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We continue to see significant increases in margin. When we get into a period of extreme volatility or a shock to the system, margin levels increase dramatically. As we get back into calm markets, they slowly drift down into what we think are, at times, artificially low levels. So our goal here is to encourage stability and resilience of the cleared markets. We think that has a direct benefit and impact to end user clients, and we think further transparency and potentially the introduction of margin floors and other mechanisms that we've talked about through the CFTC's MRAC would really be an added benefit as we think about how to evolve further and deal with sustained shocks.
Thank you very much. And finally, Ms. Crichton, I see you are the only woman on the panel today. And I know from your testimony that you are the first female chair of the FIA board in almost 70-year history. So first of all, congratulations on your accomplishment. But can you tell me, why is having more women and people from underrepresented groups in the industry important, and what can be done to address the opportunity and equity gaps?
Thank you so much for the question. I feel like it's certainly an important question, particularly during Women's History Month, as we acknowledged International Women's Day yesterday. So it's pretty historic to be here. I think it's, as I mentioned before, a topic incredibly important to the firm, to Goldman Sachs, to FIA, and certainly to me as I think about my two daughters and opportunities that they may have going forward. I'll speak primarily about FIA. When I first joined the board, I was one of two, and then quickly only the only woman in the room. And when I sat with FIA leadership, we quickly recognized that we were probably pretty representative of the industry and that more needed to be done to be able to think about ways to begin to address that. As a trade organization, it's difficult to think of the role that we play and how do we actually drive the way maybe the clearinghouses think about it or clearing members think about it. And when I looked at my own sort of almost 25-year career at Goldman, I thought of a few key things that were so critical. Really, it's information, access, mentorship, and opportunity. So the programs that we've designed in launching the FIA's Diversity Committee are really geared towards that. we don't think we can solve this alone. It really takes everyone around the table. We've partnered with a lot of groups where we've offered mentorship. We know some of you in this room on this panel have participated with us in that, so thank you. And we've offered mentorship opportunities, internships that have been converted to full-time offers. We're so excited about what we can do on the forward. It does take a lot of people to be able to participate in that, and we think FIA is uniquely positioned to help drive that going forward.
Well, I see my time has expired. Thank you so much. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ms. Crichton, I'm coming right back to you because Mr. Edwards spoke directly to my question. And I'll tell you just briefly, my degree is risk management from the University of Georgia. And aside from being the best football team in the country, they have one of the best risk management schools there. And I will tell you that my good friend David Scott went to Wharton, so I would put my University of Georgia education not quite up to yours, but anyway, enough of that. Just the risk levels throughout the world are higher today than I recall them being in many years, and they seem to be becoming faster, right? I mean, COVID happened, and the war in Ukraine, and if you go back prior to that, we didn't have really a major occurrence other than the 2008, but they seem to be becoming faster and with much more risk and volatility. So clearinghouses, they hold billions of dollars in customer funds. They're pledged against derivative positions. And under Title 8 of the Dodd-Frank Act, the Federal Reserve was authorized to provide deposit accounts to some of the clearinghouses that hold U.S. customer funds, but not all of them. Would access to Federal Reserve deposit accounts for all clearinghouses improve liquidity during times of incredible volatility across the clear derivative ecosystem? Is there any safer place in the world for deposits than the Federal Reserve?
I think the answer is we fully support access by all clearinghouses or U.S. regulated clearinghouses to have access to the Fed deposit window. We agree with your sentiments that there is no safer place in the world, particularly during times of stress, that will increase market stability and resilience, so we fully support that.
Because it would protect customer funds, and that's should be one of our goals as the committee.
That's right.
Mr. Edwards, you hit on the issue directly. Do you have anything else to say about it, or?
No, look, we want to mandate more products. If we don't provide that opportunity, well, I mean, I have one clearinghouse that is systemically important. Derek and his organization they are systemically important. But if we don't make it all, you're creating a bifurcation there, and the level of protection is different. And there's not really a great reason for it. So you can't explain it. So then why is it there?
Mr. Gauci, we talked in New York about Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the disruption. You mentioned that 10% of the calories in the world come out of the Ukraine. That whole Black Sea region is extremely important to the global food system. Could you speak to how the war in that part of the world has created market disruptions, not just in the United States but abroad? And last year, there was actually some reprieve that allowed some of the grain to move out of the ports in Ukraine. Could you speak to the shipping issues and whether or not people are actually willing to send ships back into the Ukraine to load?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Look, let's start perhaps with the second question here. As you may know, the export corridor is scheduled for to close on March 20th, right? Or the agreement that both sides have is scheduled to stop on that day. So there have no doubt been discussions as to whether or not that export corridor will remain open. The delay time from the standpoint of putting a vessel into the export corridor has tended to be anywhere from 10 10 to 12 days from the time that it goes in to inspect to ultimately the time that it begins to load grains. That delay has resulted in an increase in freight costs out of Ukraine. That has been at the detriment of the farmer, and also impacts basis in international markets. So the prospect of that closure can have very extreme volatile effects on futures markets going forward.
My time is expiring. I would just tell you that the issue of shipping through there is an extremely important part of the cost of
Yes.
to the end user, and my concern is that you're not going to be able to get the ships insured to even go into the Black Sea in the future, and that disruption in transportation, even if the crop is grown, is going to create very serious problems for the world. I appreciate all of you being here. Thank you.
All right, thank the gentleman. Now I recognize the gentlelady from Oregon, Congresswoman Salinas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the panelists. As a new member, this has been quite an education this morning. These questions are for both Mr. Edmonds and Mr. Berkowitz. We've discussed the role of volatility a lot here this morning, whether it's energy or commodity markets, and particularly unpredictable volatility poses the risk of affecting prices and stability. And we've heard, again, in the conversation this morning, that large events such as the war in Ukraine and the COVID pandemic, those are events that really could not have been predicted. So to what extent can the markets prepare for events such as these and the volatility that they could bring?
I think it's the most important thing that our clients, and when I say our clients, we have members represented by Ms. Crichton, we have clients of her firm like Mr. Gelchi there, they need to have certainty. They need to understand how the model is going to react, how we're going to call them for more margin. If we look at some of the prudential requirements placed on the members, that sometimes is not as clear as it can be. And the time of stress, typically the most blunt instrument is more is better. I can't really tell you why more or how much more. It's just more. I get to sleep a little bit better at night. Statistically, the way the models work and go out there, we provide offsets. So if you had a correlated position where you have a long here and a short there, and different products that are highly correlated, you get a benefit of that on the capital side. So we end up in a healthy tension, and I like to, if you would walk away from here, one thing, it's probably right for Mr. Salmon and I if Ms. Crichton and Mr. Gelchi are both equally unhappy. Okay, that's a healthy tension in the ecosystem that we work in, where they would like for us to charge more because they have a prudential requirement on the other side. Mr. Gelchi would like to be less because he has more business that he needs to facilitate along the way. Sometimes that's possible, sometimes it's not, and we find ourselves in that vice, typically on a daily basis, especially those days that are stressed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me provide the perspective of a former regulator, what the agency would do in the situation. So at least when I was on the commission, and I believe they have continued it, I'm not sure, we would have regular, once a week, every Friday, a briefing by our Market Intelligence Bureau on current events in the markets. And that's the function of that division within the CFTC, Market Intelligence. A number of economists and other market analysts try to look ahead, both for the staff level and provide the commission with a look ahead, what's happening in the markets. Market Intelligence staff gets their information, they read the press, they follow current events, but they also talk to the exchanges, they talk to market participants. What are you seeing? What's on the radar screen? What might be coming up? Such events such as we've been talked about, closures in the Black Sea, other possible events, and they're particularly focused on contract settlements. When these futures contracts go to settlement and people actually have to deliver the physical commodity, in the case of physically delivered commodities or financial contracts that are priced off of certain physical events, at those times, the prices at those times are very critical. So our staff, or the CFTC staff, works very closely with the exchange staff to see what's going on in the market, whether there's, maybe even call a market participant. If you have a large position, why do you have such a large position at this point in time? And maybe you should think of gradually reducing it or gradually change the position. So your particular trading does not unduly impact market volatility. So that's, from the regulator's perspective, that's what, I'll use the we, although it's not me anymore, but that's what we would do. We would work with the markets, work with the exchanges, work with the clearinghouses, follow the data, and try to have a look ahead to avoid disruptions to trading. Obviously, things occur that are not always anticipated, and then the commission will do retrospective analyses and try to figure out what happened. If there's wrongdoing involved, it will be a matter for the investigation staff, but otherwise it would be the economists and the market surveillance folks who would examine those events.
Thank you both. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Rouser, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate all of our panelists for being here. Mr. Berkovich, quick question for you, and I'll open this up to the others on the panel too. A lot of my constituents back home are quite concerned about the increase in interest rates. I personally anticipate those rates will continue to go up. What type of impact is this going to have on the commodity markets, on the financial markets in general, but the derivative markets specifically, do you think?
Well, if the interest rates go up, the costs for consumers and producers all along the value chain ultimately will go up. And at the end of the day, it's going to be the American consumer who's going to pay higher prices for commodities when there are higher interest rates.
Anybody else want to comment on that real quick?
Yeah, I think it's worth noting, I know we're here to talk about commodities markets, but CME runs the world's largest fixed income market as well, and derivatives risk covers any unexpected or potentially expected risk that you'd want to manage. So no one can control for those level of rates, but our job as a market provider, as we talked about earlier, is to provide a full suite of products and tools for customers and users to be able to hedge as best as possible and eliminate whatever. It could be price risk in corn, it could be price risk in gold, it could be price risk in rates going up or down. So I think it's a proof point for the validity and the need and the power of derivatives markets and the effect they can have on mitigating the significant swings in underlying balance sheets of a home, a corporation, a farm, or otherwise. So I think it's important to note that this committee oversees the regulatory body that oversees the world's largest U.S. interest rate market in both the short end and the long end of the curve. And those markets had an extraordinary year in volume and open interest last year for that very reason, that rates are back on the move right now.
So, Mr. Gelchi, in your testimony, you discussed the importance of speculators in the market. Most of my constituents back home, they don't like speculators. They think they manipulate the market. Talk about that a little bit. This is a big topic for a lot of people. Sure.
Thank you, Congressman. Look, the role of speculators are essentially to provide liquidity in the market, right? In order to have deep, robust markets, speculators have a role. There are times, typically, what we tend to see speculators engage during more volatile times than not. But the effect of that tends to enable consumers as well as producers to hedge their price risks in an effective manner. In a rising market, if you will, many of the farmers, if you will, are on the other side of that speculative purchasing, and conversely on the sell side, there are many consumers that take the other side of speculative activity. So we see speculators as just providing an essential role from a liquidity standpoint, and are often on the other side of many of our hedges in the derivatives market.
So would that be fair to say that they're not the ones causing the wild swings in the market? Yes,
I wouldn't attribute wild swings in the market to speculators. I would attribute the wild swings in the market to many of the factors that I had addressed previously, the geopolitics, weather, COVID-19, supply chain disruptions. They are, to me, the underlying reasons as to why the volatility exists.
And Congressman, I think it's worth noting that the importance of, if you talk about speculators, and you talk about the regulatory infrastructure that manages their ability to impact markets, whether it's, in our markets, for example, we have position limits, so the maximum amount of positions that anyone can hold in markets. We have smaller position limits for speculators than hedgers that have underlying physical exposures, whether it's wheat, whether it's corn, gold, or otherwise, and can show that underlying physical exposure, they can carry larger positions. So I think unregulated, unmanaged speculation, I think, is very different than the critical role that risk transfer agents that is served by speculators is important, with the caveat of appropriate regulatory controls around how they actively participate in markets.
Yeah. Anybody else want to comment on that?
I would just say, simply put, without the speculators in the market, your price disparity is going to be much wider, and you're going to be paying much larger prices on an everyday basis. The shock absorber analogy that Mr. Gelsey uses is correct.
Anybody else? With that, my time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and keeping with the North Carolina theme, please recognize the other gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Davis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and to the ranking member. As we come together today, I want to thank the witnesses too, and have a question I would like to direct towards Mr. Edmonds, Ms. Creighton, and Mr. Salmon. Soybeans are a top 3 crop in my district, in North Carolina's 1st Congressional District. Unfortunately, soybean farmers had to cope with the fallout of the U.S.-China trade war that commenced in 2017. From where you sit, are tariffs on agriculture imports, including soybeans, a threat to stability in commodity derivatives markets, or are they a necessary tool that our government can selectively utilize to combat unstable regimes like the PRC, who poses threat to market fundamentals?
Well, I'm going to defer soybeans directly to Mr. Salmon, because I know that's where they trade. But let me just make a point on tariffs in general. Anytime that there is an additional market impacting or market price impacting activity, it is going to be passed through to the end consumer. And that could be a higher price, that could be a lack of supply, which typically leads to higher prices along the way. Typically, you will find tariffs in that arena that causes that stress on the marketplace that have to be taken into consideration. And those who are ultimately making the trading price decision, factor that into the price they're willing to pay or which they're willing to sell.
Thanks. I guess I'll comment on it from the perspective of volatility, and I think similar to comments Mr. Edmonds made earlier, we prepare for various types of volatility in the markets. It's how we partner with clients. It's how we think about our own risk management tools, whether that's driven by terrorists or other types of factors. We're constantly thinking about and evaluating what are the different ways that we can be prepared and appropriately prepare our clients for different shocks that may impact the market. And how does it impact them, and how does that impact us and our role as a clearing member to be able to facilitate the capacity they need to continue to execute and maintain the hedges that are so critical to their price management. So I think some of the points that we talked about, and I know you mentioned earlier, the healthy tension, and I would agree, there is a healthy tension. There's a lot of robust discussion about the different ways that we think about this. From a cost perspective, one of the things that we think we can do is really stabilize the costs for end users. Part of the way that we stabilize the cost is having more predictable margin levels, more transparency in that, and then that ultimately leads to more capacity that clearing members can provide. I'll hand it to you for soybeans.
Yeah, so thank you. Yeah, we run the world's largest market for soybeans. And just to level set, in 2022, I believe Secretary Dan Glickman just penned a piece on this last week, confirming that there was a record $36.4 billion of agriculture exports to China last year, biggest ever. I think that follows up on maybe 2020 as the new #1 year. There were significant disruptions to market. I would echo what Mr. Edmonds said earlier about any impacts that interfere with price discovery, and artificial impacts to trade are extremely difficult to manage. And what we certainly support is an open, free access to markets. And where that can be enabled, we see that as the best outcome. Layers of impacts, be they taxes, or tariffs otherwise that disrupt market creates that very regulatory uncertainty the markets dislike. Our customers and market participants are used to price uncertainty and rates uncertainty, regulatory uncertainty, which is why the CFTC is so critical as a leader in the space. That's what market participants need. With the regulatory uncertainty in a jurisdiction, customers know that they've got access to risk mitigation tools, whatever comes. So not sure that fully answers your question, but we can certainly say that the export markets to China, just reflective of the dollars exported this past year, are absolutely crucial, and both ends of that hedging takes place on our markets.
Yeah, thank you. And Mr. Edmonds, real quick, energy markets are still rolling as a result of the Russian-Ukraine war that's taking place and remains a protracted stalemate, and the economic aftershocks following the pandemic continue to reverberate. Mr. Edmonds, do you think an 83% annualized volatility rate for natural gas is sustainable? I'm hearing from folks back home that instability in the energy markets is putting a squeeze on fertilizer production, resulting in high prices. Farmers can't break even if their input costs continue to outpace price points for their products. What stabilizing factors exist in the energy markets that can help give our producers some assurance of price stability?
Well, I'll be very quick because I know your time is expired, but I would tell you at the end of the day, it's not 100% because of what's happening. The face of it right now is the Russian invasion of Ukraine and where that's going. There's also a number of regulatory challenges here in this country that we need to address in order to provide clarity for those willing to make the investment and do that. We haven't seen that yet. Last year, we were looking at $7.50 natural gas. Everyone thought it was going to 10. This year, we have people going, is it going to less than $1? So while the volatility is great, the price has been reduced here. We have a lot of it. What are we going to do with it?
Thank you so much. Yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I recognize myself for 5 minutes, and I got a little bit late, so if I'm repeating myself, forgive me, but I got on the tail end of Mr. Rausser's questions. Mr. Evans, you said that spec trading actually increased or improved liquidity. Is that right?
It does improve liquidity from our vantage point, because what it does is reduces the level that you see, because you have people willing to stand in and take a price that if you're purely a commercial player, are you going to show your very best price all the time? Is it going to be as transparent? Typically it's not, and that's the role the speculator provides to frame that up.
Gotcha. Let me ask you this. So we use this term liquidity, but liquidity does not necessarily equate stability, correct?
Well, I will say without liquidity, you're not going to get stability.
Correct. So, but they're not one and the same. They're not
They're not one and the same. No.
So here's my concern, and obviously we need spec traders to take the other side of the trade in either case. But my concern is with volatility is the lack of actuals in the marketplace. Does that create a volatile climate? And what do we need to do to incentive more actuals? And where I'm going with this, if you can follow me, is farmers, for example, they don't hedge on the scale on the level that they should, and so that means the actuals, they're long actuals, but they're not short in the market.
And I'm trying to make sure I understand your question correctly. When you say actuals, you're talking about the end user,
the underlying
on
crops.
The production side. Is that
the underlying crops?
Okay. So look, I think at the end of the day, the value that speculators like Mr. Gelchi's firm provides is they don't have to operate there, because he's given them a price and they can make the decision to go out at their own. He has a lot of sophisticated tools available to him and a lot more access that maybe one single farm can't really afford to put into place. So they have a choice to make. They're now educated. They know what's there through this process. They know what they can do on their own. They can make a rational decision when they get to that point. Now, if in the purest form, if the end user, instead of me going to the grocery store, I can buy directly from the farm, I understand that transaction. I go to the farmer's market. I can do that on a daily basis. I understand. Do I know exactly what they paid for fertilizer, how much they watered the plant, whatever? No, I want to ear corn. I get an ear corn. I go put them on my grill, and I have a good time with it, with our party. But at the end of the day, in mass bulk, it's very difficult to do it as the cost of that infrastructure continues to increase. The number of parties able to do that effectively and engage with the right risk limits when they go through a membership review and things of that nature becomes incredibly difficult. And that's just the term that we built over a long time. But the price transparency that the exchange groups and the clearing mechanisms provide is the benchmark they go to look at in order to evaluate whether that offer from Mr. Gelchi's firm versus doing it on their own is appropriate.
So I guess my concern is, how integral a role do farmers actually play in price discovery today? So, I mean, if basically these transactions are taking place with hedge funds on either side of the trade, I know you're looking at fundamentals, I know you're looking at technicals, and you're making evaluations and so on, but at the turn row level, a lot of times, farmers their risk management strategy consists of a basis contract that's local. However, that's pegged to the board, right? So there's still an element of that connectivity there, but I'm just wondering, what's the direct role that farmers have in price discovery today?
Well, I would just make this, I'll turn it over to Mr. Salmon. If they don't deliver the crop, it doesn't matter what the price is. It all falls apart. They have to deliver the crop. And that's why they're so critical, and that's why we have to do all that we can to make sure that they have a path to participate in a way that works for their size operation.
So I think this ties back a little bit to your question on speculation as well. When we think about what a healthy market looks like, it's got to be a full, healthy ecosystem of all participants. You need market makers, you need market takers, those that have the risk, whether they're E&P energy firms on the production side, or farmers, or miners, or whether it's a mortgage servicer for that matter, or you need someone on the other side to take that price. And I'm looking to get exposure to a particular asset class. So we think about how to build that healthy, diversified ecosystem of participants so that price transparency can take place, so farmers know the price of soybeans for this particular product and standardized product is worth X. And I think that price transparency piece is critical so that they're informed about what the value of their product is. Whether they can directly impact those markets or not is a question of their intermediary access to these markets.
What would you estimate the percentage of participants in the market today are bona fide hedgers?
So I would probably say it's going to vary by product. Probably 20-ish% of end users. And you can see some of that from the CFTC's Commitment to Trader report. It will vary by product. It will be higher in commodities markets. It'll be lower in financial markets, between 20 and 40%, but I'd rather come back to you with a more specific answer. But if I were to spitball, that's where I'd put it.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you all. Ms. Budzinski, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for Mr. Ranking Member for putting together this very informative hearing today. I appreciate that. We've spent a lot of time, obviously, talking about market volatility and the different factors. We know, obviously, a war in Ukraine is contributing, also a public health emergency. The energy markets, though, are no stranger as well to volatility, and my colleague, Congressman Davis, also touched a little bit on that related to natural gas. My district, the 13th District of Illinois, is really a hub for innovations in our energy markets, specifically around biofuels and other sustainable fuels that can help increase what I would hope is certainty and security in these markets. And so maybe I could start by directing this question to Mr. Berkowitz, but then open it up to the rest of the panel on your thoughts on the impacts of biofuels and how they relate to the commodity markets as well.
Thank you, Congresswoman. So biofuels are incredibly important as part of the energy mixture and part of the input into fuel that people drive in their cars and other vehicles. So as another input, it affects a number of other commodities too. It's related to the price of corn, increases demand. It also has the price of corn and other biofuels people plant for biofuels in addition to agricultural demand. It affects the price of gasoline. It's another component there, and reduces the demand for oil to a certain extent, so it affects that commodity. So it's an absolutely critical component, and I know my other folks on the panel who are actually from the exchanges can explain well the actual interaction on the exchange and the suite of fuels and the interactions between these various commodities, but it's well studied economically how increases or decreases in demand for biofuels affect the demand for gasoline. But it's an integral part of the energy risk management sector as well as the agricultural sector.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It speaks to the broader question of energy transition and what is this market going to look like in 20, 30 years? There are very different opinions on the timeline of that and the shape and the scope and the scale and the speed with which we'll get there. Specifically, to your point, soybean oil is a critical feedstock for products like renewable diesel. It's also, in and of itself, hugely important to the ag market. You know, our bean complex is effectively 3 products. It's soybeans, it's crush, and it's meal. And those are used for very different reasons, and increasingly the differences between what used to be an energy market and an ag market are now blurring because of markets like biofuels and ethanol. Is ethanol a corn product, or is it actually a fuel product that should be run inside an energy business, for example? Ethanol feedstock for gasoline, and this is a global product. There's a European ethanol market, there's a U.S. ethanol market, and those are being derived from U.S. stocks here as well. Methanol, biofuel feedstock used in bunker fuel, for example. So there's a number of products out there that I think are also, well, these are still relatively small, probably soybean oil is the biggest of these, are rising in importance. And at various points in time, we've had discussions, you know, food versus fuel. Where's that efficient frontier, and what's the best outcome for use of these products? So it's a changing time for the environmental products market. We partner with our customers and end users and intermediaries to develop those products that reflect the risks that they are trying to manage through an uncertain speed and shape of what will be an energy transition story.
Thank you. I don't know if any other panelists would like to add, and if not, I have one other question maybe for Ms. Crichton. You know, it's very clear in the global derivatives market that practices abroad can have a domino effect across the sector. In the same light, inconsistency among risk management methods can stifle security in the derivatives market's ability to withstand volatility. Can you speak to the work that is being done across the globe that can add to protections for our participants here at home?
Sure, thank you. It's a great question. I guess I'll use a couple of examples. One is, and I think Mr. Salmon referred to it in his testimony, the events that we saw on the London Metals Exchange in March of last year. I think, you know, we've been asked many times as an industry, I think as individuals, does that have the ability, can that happen here? Can that happen in U.S. markets? I think first thing we would point to is the volatility control mechanisms that many of us referred to, whether it's risk controls, price controls, position limits. We think they're all critically important to helping resilient and stable markets. We think the U.S. regulated, CFTC regulated exchanges and clearinghouses do a terrific job in that regard, and we think they do, and FIA is doing a lot of work to kind of create that as a set of global standards to be able to share with that global community. When we think about how we provide global access, that really becomes critically important of having a set of standards, right? We operate a portfolio of providing access to exchanges and clearinghouses globally. For many of us, that's north of 60 in dozens of jurisdictions around the world. You want to know that you have the same set of principles that govern how we think about risk, how we think about the volatility control mechanisms. All of those are consistent really around the globe. I think the other good example to highlight when we debate skin in the game, for example. It's been a long time discussion in the US. We think that'll continue to evolve. If we look at regulation that's happening across Europe from a European perspective, the EU has passed regulation where they're actually mandating clearinghouses to have more skin in the game. The UK is actually looking at similar regulation as well. We think that's an important step forward, and we look forward to continuing the discussion here.
Thank you so much. I'll go ahead and yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Boss, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to put on the record and thank the Chairman Thompson for allowing me to be back on this vitally important committee to my district. I spent 6 years on the committee right after being elected, and then I've spent 2 years and 2 months off and begging the whole time to get back. So I'm really feeling great about being back on the committee. And the reason being is my district in Southern Illinois is one of the most diverse agricultural districts in the country. And I am happy to provide them the voice here on this committee. Now, one of the things that I hear about often from the producers back in the district is the importance of liquidity and access to capital. Mr. Salmon, in your written testimony, you referred to an independent review of what happened in the London nickel market in March 2022 as an example of the need for strong oversight and risk management. Did that study provide any more details about what we can learn from the distribution in that market, and also as input prices go up, like what my constituents are seeing with fertilizer prices, and how does that work and with the CFTC is doing to mitigate some of the effects on the producer?
So it's a great question, Congressman. Thank you for that. I think the importance of what we saw happen in London in the nickel market really, as I mentioned in my testimony, written specifically, is highlight the incredible importance of the risk mitigation tools both at the exchange level and at the clearinghouse level to ensure orderly markets. I'll give you a quick rundown of a couple of things here. Position limits, number one. There were not necessarily a position limits regime on that market, in that market. This is something that's part and parcel of CFTC regulation. We have different size limits for speculators and hedgers, as I mentioned before. That's critically important. If you are carrying a large amount of physical underlying, then you should have access to an appropriately off-size position as long as you can show market reg departments that here's my risk, here's my offset, and that's why I'm carrying that. Speculators have smaller positions. We have position limits that differ by spot month versus deferred month or across all contract months. That's important to make sure that there's not an outsized impact of any position holder in a market. Things like daily price limits, and we have those in enumerated commodities like ags, where we have hard limits where, as you know, Congressman, wheat, corn, beans, there's only a set amount that market can move on a daily basis, and then we have very clear, transparent rules for if we lock limit up consecutive days, how that opens the following day. Determination and a deterministic market behavior is what market providers need and users need. They did not have that in the case of the London market. Other areas, circuit breakers, things like velocity logic in our market that slow market moves, that if a market moves beyond a specified amount in a specified time period, we implement market halts. So at the exchange level, we're slowing markets before they start to run away where we don't have hard limits in certain markets. We've talked a lot about margin today, talked a lot about initial margin. Variation margin is critical. Variation margin is what flows every day to top up accounts that have lost money on that day and credits for those customers that are seeing gains in their positions every day. CME Group runs twice daily variation margin runs to ensure that no excess loss is built up in the system anywhere. Also something that was missing at that other particular exchange. Market reg oversight to ensure not just appropriate activity for users in our market, but positions that they're holding as well. And they have the power to go investigate what those customers claim they have. Proactive margin management, liquidity-based margin add-ons, concentration-based add-ons, all of the ways in which we ensure that our markets are safe, secure, deterministic for users, and people know what the rules are going to be and how markets will react when you have market stress. Mr. Edmonds mentioned that before. That's what users flock to. That's what the CFT has helped us provide. That's why we are, in this regulatory framework, the benchmark globally of derivatives markets.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I also have heard from my constituents, obviously, from serious concerns about the recent action taken by Mexico in banning GMO corn. This is a serious concern of mine, and I've joined with several of my colleagues in writing a letter to the administration calling for action from the USMCA. What effects does the CME seen on the global derivative? I'm not sure what my tongue's doing. Derivative markets so far based on Mexico's action, and if no substantive effects have occurred, can the CFTC help absorb any changes in the market?
Great question. I think relative to how we answered the question earlier on tariffs and kind of market disruptions, we see disruptions to free trade flow and price setting as problematic for all users, and that just increases instability. It increases the eventual price that gets passed on to the end consumer. It's not good for anybody. We have not seen a direct impact on our core market, which is, we run the largest core market in the world. We haven't seen that yet. That said, we're in constant conversation with both the farmers, producers, and users, folks like Louis Dreyfus and how that impacts them, and the agency. And I'd probably defer to Honorable Mr. Berkovitz for his thoughts on how to answer a CFTC perspective on that.
We'll have to defer that.
I think we'll have to wait on that because I'm out of time.
We've run out of time. Thank you, Mr. Bost. Ms. Adams, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Let me also thank all of our witnesses today. I want to address my questions to Mr. Berkovitz first. In your testimony, sir, you noted the need for improvements to our risk management tools in order to adequately and accurately respond to severe weather or climate-related risk. So would you elaborate on what updates are necessary and the extent to which the CFTC has the authority to implement such changes?
Thank you, Congresswoman. So the three areas that I outlined in my testimony are: one is the development of new products and markets to provide better risk management tools to address severe weather-related events. The CFTC doesn't have authority to mandate new products or new markets, but it can encourage it and facilitate it, and that's what the advisory committee process is for. And the CFTC has put out a request for information asking the very questions that you just identified. What can the CFTC do? What is the CFTC's role? But it's really this is really a market-based solution that the products in the markets and the markets themselves to develop. So my suggestion or my encouragement is for the CFTC to work closely with market participants and try to facilitate the development to the extent that there's regulatory issues or obstacles to the development of any of these products, or it needs expedited approval. The CFTC can certainly expedite the approval.
So let me ask you, where should the focus of Congress be to ensure the effectiveness of commodity markets and derivatives products as tools for risk management and price discovery?
So I think the continued support of the committee, which this committee's always been very, very supportive of the efforts of the CFTC and providing direction to the CFTC in the areas that the commission, that the committee believes the commission should focus on. So if the committee were to believe that this is an area that the commission should focus on and work with the private sector to develop these new products and to develop these new markets and to oversee these new markets, that would be of great assistance to the commission in conducting those activities.
Thank you, sir. Let me move quickly to Mr. Salmon. I appreciate your focus on the importance of the U.S. agricultural production to global economy, commodity markets, and their vulnerability to trade policy. It speaks to the importance of the work that this committee and our nation's farmers do. Farmers are long experienced with the risk posed by weather events, and as a result, the Agriculture Committee and USDA have focused on improving our commodity safety net through investment in Title I commodity programs. Last summer, CFTC issued a request for information soliciting public input on climate-related financial risks, including physical and transitional risks. To what extent has CME participated in conversations on climate risk with the CFTC? And what's been your primary focus, and what role, if any, can Congress play in providing guidance to CFTC?
So, terrific question. Thank you for that. As actually the Honorable Mr. Berkovitz indicated, I represent CME Group on his old committee, the Energy and Environmental Markets Advisory Committee. That's chaired by Commissioner Mersinger now. And the point of that is to actually address some of these issues head on. So we are very deeply involved with the CFTC, both at the committee level, but also bilaterally in terms of issues that we see, whether that's on the product development side and products that we're hearing from our customers. We've been asked to develop transition fuels, things like battery metals, and how those markets evolve. You know, it's critical for us that we not only go through that due diligence process for validating a product idea, we then go to the CFTC, as this committee knows, and have to prove that these markets are ready for a derivative contract, that they're deep and liquid, satisfy all the core principles of the CFTC. So from product development and a solutions point of view, that's a direct dialogue. At the committee level and at the enterprise level, CME Group is very actively involved in not only managing and reporting on our own client risks around environmental change, but those in the industry as well. And I think the industry is communicating on these issues. There are a number of regulatory bodies bringing this discussion together so that we understand what the impacts are industry as a whole and how we each individually contribute to that.
Thank you, sir, and thank you both. And Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. LaMalfa, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Apologies for missing much of this hearing, as there's always multiple committees going on. So I do have a couple questions that we prepared on on the topic. So let me go to Mr. Gelchi. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have ripple effects through many aspects of our economy and our industries, but agriculture's been hit hard as well as energy. What policies can Congress implement to better reduce the volatility in our food and fiber markets? What we should be doing to have more integrity and less ups and downs?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Congressman. I think really, some of the factors that perhaps have related to Russia, Ukraine, clearly impacts the consumers here in the United States, as you mentioned. But what I think is important to also note is that the wheat, the corn markets are global markets, right? And so while the U.S. Farmers are essentially also, and the U.S. users are also participants in these, the volatility that you mentioned is just a function of these markets in order to attempt to find what its proper price should be, given those circumstances. In so much as the geopolitics does create uncertainty of supply out of Russia, out of Ukraine. At the same time, as I had mentioned earlier, the notion of the prospect of closing the export corridor can have further impacts on not only supply coming out of Ukraine, but then it shifts the focus in terms of where the demand base needs to originate from, such as Central America, South America, and the U.S. And so, really, I think in terms of factors that can reduce that volatility. We had mentioned the various inputs from the exchanges in terms of position limits for speculative purposes. But ultimately, I think the market will set the price of what those commodities need to be.
Certainly. All right. Well, as a farmer, I certainly understand the aspect that on the farming side, at least, we're price takers, not price makers, so applies more widely too. Mr. Crichton, what can end users do to better prepare for the next period of volatility? What the end users, what can they do?
Yeah. Thank you. It's a great question. We do spend a lot of time with our clients and users included to think about how to prepare for the next round of volatility. Really, where we focus is predominantly around margin. What is the sufficiency of margin that the clearinghouses are charging on the portfolios? What do we think are potential shocks? What are the sizes of those shocks? And how much may that increase exchange margin? We work with end users to think about what their liquidity needs and to appropriately forecast what those are. We think that is the best way for end users and clients to prepare for periods of volatility, being prepared from a liquidity and funding standpoint to withstand that.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Edmonds, derivative markets are evolving faster than the regulations can keep up with. So what would you propose for us at the federal level and state regulators as well to follow and ensure that the developments are being kept up with, at least in a somewhat timely fashion?
I think you're seeking certainty at the end of the day, and when proposed regulation comes before you and you having a chance to opine on that, asking the question, why is this helping the question of certainty? And if you can get a very good answer you have confidence in, it's probably worthwhile. And if you get an answer that you walk away from very confused, it's probably not worthwhile at the end of the day. The healthy tension we talked about, they're all agendas that are represented here, and we see things in a very different lens that sometimes has an impact on the regulatory process. Sometimes that is captured correctly, and sometimes that's captured incorrectly, and that's where we spend lots of our time debating that issue. But ask the question why and make sure for certainty.
I appreciate that. I just came up the hall from the Natural Resources Committee where I'm constantly confused at some of the environmental regulations and how they're been reinterpreted over 50 years and come out there a little confused as what their goal is there. So, well, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate it. Thank you, and thank you to our panelists. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Ms. Crockett, I have to apologize for, I should have recognized you the last time. I hope you'll forgive me, but you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Do not apologize. I will always defer to Ms. Alma. Good morning, and thank you so much to all of you being here. And thank you, Chairman. We've heard a lot today about the benefits farmers get from using futures contracts because it creates stability. I've heard so many farmers and ranchers concerned about changing global conditions. In fact, our first hearing was on the uncertainty facing American agriculture. So it seems to me that all farmers would stand to benefit from being able to hedge against this uncertainty, which is what these products that we've been talking about, what they do. Do I have that right, Ms. Crichton?
You do, yes.
Thank you. But I do have some concerns. As I was reviewing the USDA report from October of 2020, it states that less than 3% of farmers are using these options. Does that sound about right to you?
I don't actually have that information, but we'd be happy to look into it and follow up with you.
What's concerning, if this is accurate, is that for decades, small farmers have lost their farms because they can't compete with larger, better resource competitors. In human terms, these farms that represent someone's hopes and dreams, in the case of new farmers, they don't have the same opportunities. And so I'm concerned that our small and or underserved farmers aren't using these tools because we know that, sadly enough, the lender of last resort, the USDA, has a troubled history when it comes to serving minority farmers specifically. So I must ask, Ms. Crichton, what is your firm doing and what can this committee do to increase utilization of these financial products for beginning and underserved farmers?
Sure. I'll provide perspective from the FIA standpoint, and I'll answer that really in two ways. One, the FIA, and I think there are resources across the exchanges and clearinghouses that provide information and educational resources about how to effectively use these markets for risk management purposes. Part of the challenge we find at times is the amount of information that persists throughout the system of what's available and how to access the capacity that is available. The other perspective that I'll answer it from is really, what we think about really is providing access and how do we ensure that we and other clearing members can continue to stand in and provide capacity. And a lot of that really comes down to the risk management topics that we're discussing today. I think in terms of some more specifics to your question, again, I think there are others within FIA and the firm that can help provide information on follow-up, and we're happy to do that.
I appreciate that. It just feels sometimes, and not just in this space, I want to be clear, that there are multiple financial services, right? Like there's one for the largest growers, which we are hearing a lot about today, and then there's ones for the hundreds of millions of small farmers who face the same hardships with fewer resources at their disposal. Mr. Chairman, I apologize. I hope that this committee can work on these issues to set our farmers up for success for generations to come. And with that, I will yield. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Crockett. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Jackson, you are on deck. Ms. Crichton, you talked about the importance of analyzing the sufficiency of margin, and that requires obviously analyzing the potential shocks. Give us some sense, what types of events are assessed to create the most shocks? They're not black swan events, because I guess you guys are thinking about them and talking about them, but what gray swan events are most concerning to the system?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about, again, really across our members and certainly internally. When we look at what's happened over the course of the last few years, I think as we've discussed over time, the number of shocks, the number of 1 in 100 year events seem to happen more and more frequently. So how do we prepare for those? Again, the exchanges run their margin models. In addition, clearing members typically run their own margin models, and we compare and contrast those, right? We think there are a number of different ways to be informed on better ways and more efficient ways to risk manage, and we do take into account a number of macroeconomic factors as we think about what are the shocks to apply to a particular portfolio.
But is there a particular type of event that shocks the system in a particularly egregious way?
I think we're finding there are multiple types of events that can shock the system in an egregious way, and we try and take into account what has history informed us of the types of shocks, the magnitude of those shocks, and what do we need to be prepared for on the forward. I don't think we focus on any particular type of event, just the fact that they can occur. They seem to occur more frequently, and ensuring that margin models can predict or help users predict what their margin requirements may move to.
Okay, so and you talked about the LME situation with nickel in your testimony. You know, on its surface, it seems like the cause is pretty obvious. People were concerned about the availability of Russian nickel. Is there more to it, more nuances to the causation that we should keep in mind?
Yeah, I think it goes back to a number of items that we're discussing today. In terms of the volatility control mechanisms that we've talked about the benefits of, from price banding, price controls, circuit breakers, position limits, all of those are a crucial layer of controls that exist at the exchanges themselves. We think U.S. and CFTC regulated exchanges do a particularly good job in that regard. We think in that vein, they continue to be informed by market events and refine those controls and improve them on the forward. That was largely unavailable on the LME. In addition, we looked at the size of the margin that was being charged on the contracts themselves. We viewed that to be insufficient. And then if we think about the skin in the game layer that was available, and this is all publicly reported, LME had $25 million as their capital at risk. Clearing members, there was roughly 40 at the time, had $1 billion at risk. At the end of that month, that was March of 22, at the end of the month, margin levels had increased. Some circuit breakers were put in place. The CCP capital at risk stayed the same at $25 million. Member contributions were doubled to $2 billion, right? So it highlights the importance.
So there were
of the
some
checks and the
impacts and some
alignment.
improvements,
Absolutely.
lessons learned, if you will.
I think it highlighted some of the deficiencies and the reactions to those deficiencies, and that's what we're trying to really highlight here in our conversations, ensuring that that can't happen anywhere else.
And when I look at, I mean, I'm a layperson, but when I look at, $4 billion worth of trades canceled, that seems to me to be a critical failure. I mean, that's like the last place you want to get to.
We would agree.
I can't imagine that happens very, very often with American-based exchanges.
We don't think it does, and we wouldn't expect it to happen here.
Yeah.
Again, the importance of each of those layers of controls working in coordination with each other are critically important. It's about aligning incentives from a risk perspective, but each of those layers is foundational to ensuring that that doesn't happen here.
So we had some good back and forth with, I think, Mr. Bost, Mr. Salmons about some of the differences. But Mr. Edmonds, let's talk about ICE. What could something like that happen on ICE?
Just to be clear, your question is, could something like LME happen at ICE?
Right.
We have all the same controls that have been referenced by Mr. Salmon and Ms. Crichton here. I've said this a couple of times today. It's about certainty. It's about certainty of how we're going to behave. It's about certainty that we, the clearinghouse or the exchange, are going to execute our rule book, because that's what all of the members and the customers expect us to do at the moment in time. And in the case of LME, I think it's pretty clear what's being publicly reported, that did not happen.
Last question, Ms. Crichton. We've talked about some of the reforms LME has made to learn lessons from that shock to the system. What percentage of the way are they to completely have integrating these lessons learned?
We think they have made a number of improvements. They still have a number of things to do. There have been studies that have been conducted by independent consultants that we are continuing to wait for data from the market to inform additional steps that they need to take. The Bank of England has also been doing a review and recommending actions that they need to take as well. So we think they're part of the way through. They are not all the way through.
Thanks very much. I am over time. Mr. Jackson, and then Mr. Mann is on deck.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Scott. I had the great opportunity to be a runner at the Chicago Board of Trade, a runner at the New York Stock Exchange, and now that world has gone away because of technology and electronics. And so let us say that evolution is natural and risk is not a bad four-letter word, that it's something that we have to live with. We're going to have risk in energy, risk in weather. Risk is here to stay. Mr. Gelchi, I'd like to first direct a question to you. In your testimony, you referenced the self-policing effort of the commodities exchanges. I'd like to get further information on why you would say that we can look forward to self-policing as a good thing. We've seen in our lifetime the long-term capital. We've seen Morgan Stanley. We've seen Lehman Brothers. We've seen risk that was supposed to have been contained because of self-interest and some economic theories. How can we ensure that self-policing is the best mechanism to have an orderly market?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. I think, look, when I refer to self-policing and the gold standard of risk management, I think many of the comments today by by the panelists here, I think reflect the notion of position limits, the oversight here of this committee to the CFTC, the interrelationship that they have with the various exchanges, the compliance individuals within the exchanges and their interaction with the various members. So to me, it's that regard of being as close to the trading itself that ensures a robust discussion should volatility come up that reflects the need to elevate and escalate. I think we have the appropriate mechanisms in place within the U.S. markets here to address that, and thus my point being the self-policing methodology is best in class.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Crichton, we've seen a concentration now of the clearinghouses after market shocks and after market challenges. Is this a good trend or is it a bad trend in your opinion?
Thank you for the question. It's definitely something we worry about. The area specifically that we focus on is the concentration or the reduced number of clearing members that are providing capacity to the system. If we look at the last 20 years, the number of clearing members providing capacity has reduced by about half, while the margin in the system has increased by about 600%. So that, just by that magnitude alone, you can see that there are some capacity considerations. There are really high barriers to entry. There are high barriers to continuing to wanting to provide capacity, but it is something that we do worry about, and it is a concerning trend.
Thank you. Mr. Salmon, thank you for your leadership at the CME. That's a shameless plug for the Chicagoans that are in the Ag Committee. But proud to be on the Agricultural Committee from the 1st District of Illinois in the city of Chicago. And Chicago still has the leadership for the nation and the world in this market, in these derivative products. Anything on the horizon that you can see that would be a challenge, or what we can do as regulators to make sure that we keep this great financial piece of architecture in the city of Chicago, more importantly, in the United States, that we continue to have the edge, if you will, on this open market with securitization and transparency and liquidity?
Yeah, we absolutely support the engagement we have with the CFTC, as we've talked about tangentially, but I just want to say directly, coming through Dodd-Frank, speaking from an exchange point of view, we were concerned that coming out of the financial crisis of 08-09, that with the U.S. regulatory jurisdiction going first and what looked like a significant lift and change to how margin practices and how businesses are run, we thought that there was a real danger that would push markets out into less well-regulated jurisdictions and outside of the U.S. In the reality, how it worked out is Dodd-Frank was the first to be minted, to the point that you've heard from all of us today in our testimony. Market participants need determinism. They need to know the governance of the clearing firms and the clearing houses and the exchanges on which they operate. So when something happens, they know the rule book says it's going to do this. That is, come back to the standing chairman's point, did not exist in the LME, kind of made up rules on the fly. So I think to answer your question directly, the most important thing we can do to maintain leadership in the global derivatives industry, to make sure that markets trade on CME or CFTC regulated markets that are represented across this panel here today, well-regulated markets continue to partner with the industry and with the providers through FIA, through the exchanges, through the clearinghouses, and the commission through commitments to make sure that we're listening to customers. We are being innovative in how we develop and advance our markets in light of what is certainly not a decreased amount of risk in the world. Energy transition is tangential to what we talked about today, but it impacts everything. So we think that's an important part to get in front of. So thank you for your support, and hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you for your participation and all of the witnesses that gave testimony today. I think someone's knocking on the door.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. Mr. Mann will be followed by Mr. Kassar.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson. Thank you all for being here this morning. I represent the 1st District of Kansas, which is about 2/3 of our state, one of the biggest ag producing districts in the country. My district's about the same size as Illinois, which is large for some, small compared to Dusty Johnson's district of South Dakota. But, you know, we grow a lot of beef, #1 wheat producer in the country, #1 sorghum producer in the country. I'm constantly viewing all these issues, you know, through the eyes of our ag producers, making sure that these markets function for the folks that are growing these crops. First question would be for you, Mr. Geltz. I understand when you started off with your company, you came to Kansas and we're auditing the grain levels in some of our elevators. How would you say what you do today impacts producers in Kansas and throughout this country, and explain the important role that your company plays in these markets and everyone's interest in making sure all these markets are functioning effectively?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. Again, what I would say is Louis Dreyfus harmonizes the very different needs of its customers. I had mentioned earlier as to the fact that we have buyers, sellers that we transact with on a variety of different agricultural products on a minute-by-minute basis, right? Whether that's at our production facility in Claypool or at our ethanol facility in Grand Junction, for example. But also from a global standpoint, as these markets are global, we have producers from Brazil that may be hedging through and selling us cash contracts that we in turn hedge into the futures markets. So what I think our role, if you will, is to provide them with the services understanding of what is happening in our view in terms of the underlying markets that are most interesting to them, to give them the information they need to hedge and price effectively, and then at the same time we warehouse much of that risk in our book as a hedger. And so we're perpetually getting in and out of these derivatives markets as a result of the transactions that our group is involved in.
And then if you could speak to speculation a little bit. In your testimony, you discussed the importance of speculators in the market. Can you elaborate on why you believe speculators are important to a healthy market and how that impacts our ag producers all over the country?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Again, it is our view that in order to encourage deep and robust markets, that speculation is a required element of the market. As a hedger, we often rely also on that speculative activity to provide enough volume for us to hedge into those markets. So in our view, the necessity of the speculator, provided that they are managed appropriately by the exchanges vis-a-vis position limits, is a crucial part to market participation.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's an important thing that we've got to keep bringing up and making sure that everyone involved understands their important role. Next question would be for you, Ms. Crichton. In your testimony, you mentioned forthcoming revisions to the bank capital standards. Can you elaborate more on the interaction between capital standards and access to clearing services and what you kind of see happening here moving forward?
Sure. We think bank capital standards have a direct impact on the amount of clearing capacity that clearing members can provide. The more punitive those capital standards are, the less ability clearing members have to potentially provide much-needed capacity to end users and other investors. As we think forward, and we know there are new phases of the Basel rules coming, we'd encourage policymakers and regulators to ensure that bank capital rules don't become even more punitive to banks. Otherwise, that will impact their ability to provide capacity.
Great, thank you. One last quick question for you, Mr. Edmonds. How can we best anticipate and manage the emerging risks to cleared markets? What's the best way, in your view, that we look ahead? You know, it's easy to look back, but how do we anticipate what's coming down, and how do we manage that risk?
Well, we look around every corner, right? I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, that's our job, to make sure that we're prepared for as many things defined as Mr. Johnson was asking earlier about, you know, what are we looking for? You know, it could be anything that impacts the price. It could be regulation, it could be the lack of regulation, it could be disruption in shipping lines, it could be cyber, as we've learned as an industry over the past month or so. All of those things have an impact that we have to be prepared for, and we're never going to know everything, but we have to let people know how we're going to behave when something unknown is staring us in the face.
Great. Thank you. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Now please to recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Kassar, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, getting used to this microphone. So egg prices, as we know, have doubled for consumers in the course of about a year, going from $1.78 in December of 2021 to $4.25 in 2022 for a dozen eggs. And the production and distribution of eggs, as we know, is dominated by just a handful of companies. The big four meatpacking corporations control, as we heard in recent testimony, about 85% of the beef market. Beef prices are up by double digits, and these companies' net profits have increased considerably, potentially by over 300% through the course of the pandemic. In my view, it's up to us to help working families and to set up an economy that works for small businesses in agriculture, not just the big guys. So, Mr. Berkowitz, my question is for you, sir. Thanks so much for your service and for your testimony. We've heard a lot and talked a lot about, in this committee and others, about Russia's war on Ukraine and its contribution to inflation, supply chains, the pandemic, but haven't heard as much about how anti-competitive practices and market consolidation also contribute to the volatilities that we've seen for consumers and in commodities markets. So in your view, to what extent does market consolidation contribute to those price increases and to market volatility?
Thank you, Congressman. I can't really separate out that component in terms of all the factors that you've mentioned in terms of the risks and whether indeed I wouldn't be the appropriate person to say exactly what that impact would have been, particularly in light of all the other factors that have contributed to the price. But each one of these components itself contributes to a certain degree, and that's why the markets exist, to say, well, there's a whole world of risk out there. I'm a small business, I'm a small farmer. I might not have all these tools, but if I can access a market and I can go on a futures market and get certainty as to what price I'm going to get for my product, then I'm going to go on a market and lock in that price.
Understood, and I appreciate that's part of the mission of the CFTC, as you so perfectly put in your testimony, that the mission is the integrity of those commodity markets to prevent manipulation and promote fair competition amongst market participants. And so, I saw in your testimony good work and conversation about regulating rampant speculation, regulating against fraud. But in your view, does the CFTC have a mandate to think about competition when they're trying to achieve that mission of making sure there's fairness amongst market participants? So do you think that there's a mandate to better regulate competition in those markets?
Competition in terms of the services we're talking about, in terms of access to the market and getting access to the market and clearing. There are multiple clearing houses, there are multiple exchanges, there's multiple futures commission merchants, there's different people competing within the derivatives markets and the futures industry for customer business to provide services. The CFTC's mission and charge in the statute is to provide fair competition in the provision of those services. We're not a fair competition in terms of the Federal Trade Commission and in terms of generalized economic competition in the economy.
But when the underlying economic conditions have had such consolidation, Do you not think that within the CFTC's mandate, that should be something that you're ultimately?
Well, one of the things I was particularly concerned about is something that has been mentioned by other panelists here: consolidation in the futures commission merchant sector in terms of the availability of multiple futures commission merchants, particularly for farmers and the smaller traders. We've seen a large shrinkage in the number of FCMs over the past decade or so. The number continues to decrease. Hasn't been a particularly profitable business. So that's the type of that's the type of competition that the CFTC should be focused on. In terms of whether there's too much consolidation in an industry like an airline industry or some other types of industries, that's not really the CFTC's mandate.
Well, and I think, there's a storied history to all of these agencies. There's a lot in the authorizing bills, and so it's something we'd like to continue to dig in on, is the issues you've raised, but some of those underlying issues, where might we have the ability to stand up for some of these smaller businesses, smaller market participants to have a fair shake. Thank you. And I yield back. No time. Made it right at 5.
There you go. Perfect. Gentleman yields back. Now please recognize gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Fincher, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson and Ranking Member Scott. And I want to thank our witnesses for being here today and discussing these important issues. They're very critical. In my district, the global commodity markets play a critical role in mitigating risk and providing certainty for our farmers, our producers, and obviously our small businesses. And during periods of extreme volatility and derivative markets provide a predictable and allow our rural communities to prosper. It all goes together. So my question, Ms. Crichton, following the market disruptions we saw during the early days of the pandemic and Russia's invasion to Ukraine, end users saw clearinghouse initial margin requirements rise significantly. Both events caused liquidity demands totaling over $100 billion for market participants. In order to hopefully lessen the severity for future liquidity crunches, do you think it makes sense for clearinghouse margins to be enhanced so that there's a more robust and stable market cycles, both in the good times and the bad times?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. As I mentioned before, margin generally is something we spend a lot of time thinking about and discussing, and as FIA, working with the clearinghouses and suggesting different ways to improve the margin regimes. I think I'll credit the CFTC's MRAC committee. Through that committee, originally under the sponsorship of then Commissioner Benham, now under the sponsorship of Commissioner Johnson, we convened a group of clearinghouses and users and FCMs to discuss topics under the guise of CCP risk and governance. One of the most critical topics we discussed, in our view, was margin, and we produced a paper that is in front of the CFTC now. We're hoping for that. We'll have further consideration as we get through the governance proposals that they've moved forward. To your point specifically on the large and dramatic increases in margin, it is something that we do worry about. We think it increased cost to end users. We think it creates a destabilizing effect, ultimately having the potential for systemic risk, right? In times of low volatility, we think margin levels decrease and they ultimately end up too low. In times of high volatility, margin rates ultimately end up needing to chase the risk, becoming incredibly high, increasing short-term funding demands on clients. As you have multiple end users and clients looking to source those same short-term liquidity, it increases costs for end users across the board. So what we want to do is are encouraging for the introduction of floors, the constant reevaluation for the CCPs that do have them in place. So margin levels can't go too low in times of low volatility. It sort of mutes the impact when the margin increases need to chase that risk up, and we think creates a more stable funding environment for end users.
So through the CFTC, I mean, when do you think through your paper that was sent to them, when do you think we'll hear from them? Have they given you any information on that, or?
We're hoping for the second half of this year. We had provided some recommendations from a governance standpoint, and we had also provided rule text in that regard. That is being considered by the CFTC for a vote on those rule proposals shortly. We hope once that moves through, then we can focus as a group on the margin recommendations that were made. So we're hoping for the second half of this year.
Well, thank you, Ms. Creighton.
Thank you.
Very valuable. I got a quick question for Mr. Gilchie. In your testimony, you discussed the limited availability of the dollar currency exchange. Can you quickly expand on that point and how it impacts your ability to manage your business?
Sure. No, thank you, Congressman. Look, strength in the U.S. dollar relative to interest rates here have actually created a void of dollars overseas with respect to end users. So, from that standpoint, it's made it a bit challenging for some users overseas of the U.S. products in terms of opening up letters of credit, for example. So that in and of itself has been one of the challenges that we've faced as a result of perhaps an accelerated interest rate increase.
That's right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Ms. Creighton, just one more question. I got 40 seconds left. A recent survey by the Committee on Payments and Market Infrastructures indicated that only around 20% of the clearinghouse provides tools for end users to estimate how their margin requirements could change during periods of market volatility. I'm going back to this. Can you speak more about the possible solution clearinghouses could take to enhance the transparency of margin requirements to help farmers and ranchers and other users better prepare for these future stress events? Ms. Creighton.
Apologies, I wasn't sure if that was for Mr. Edmonds. Yeah, we do think tools from clearinghouses would be helpful, web-based tools, information that's provided to the clearing members to be able to then share with their end users and clients. We think there's a number of different ways that that information can be disseminated through the system. We think the education needs to happen, the transparency needs to happen up front, rather than through disclosures that happen multiple months or quarters behind.
That's right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ms. Creighton.
Can I just add one thing to that very quickly?
Sure,
I know that the question came, how can you sort of get an assessment for that margin requirement? Just to be clear, at least on the CME Group side, we have a tool to allow customers to upload a portfolio that will calculate the margin. This is a pre-trade tool because margins become an important part, and cost of capital, as you talked about today, is making everything more expensive. So from a transparency point of view, enable customers to upload portfolios that they might trade and say, this is what the margin requirement would be. Now, in terms of forward-looking how that might change, that's less clear. But in terms of the ability to have an assessment, this is the margin that would be required to carry this sort of position. Those tools exist, and that's an important pre-trade risk decision that customers have access to.
Significant. Glad to hear that. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now, pleased to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Carvall, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses being here today. Mr. Berkowitz, you mentioned that some of the events leading to market volatility could not have been predicted, like COVID and Russia's war in Ukraine. Could you speak to what extent you have seen the volatility in agricultural commodity markets impact farmers and producers' ability to use the derivatives market for price risk management?
Thank you, Congressman. I think one of the items that has been mentioned by a number of panelists is the margin requirements, the certainty of margin requirements, but also the level of margin requirements as volatility goes up and prices go up. These margin requirements, which is how much money you have to put up when you place a trade, increases and therefore makes the costs of hedging more expensive. So the time you need the hedging the most, the price increases, which makes it even more difficult to use these risk management tools. So I think that's the primary concern that I have heard regarding margin and prices. Now, generally, as also talked about, it's a fairly sophisticated market. These tools takes a fair degree of sophistication to use them, so there needs to be also, as has been discussed, an educational effort to make sure that the market participants and farmers know what the advantages of the tools are, know how the tools can benefit them.
And how do you think we could expand that education?
Well, I think market participants have a function in that, and CFTC has a component, if you look at the CFTC's website, has educational materials and on the markets. So I think it's a combined effort to make CFTC transparency and benefits, but also the industry, and I know the exchanges and the brokers, the Futures Commission merchants also have programs to do that as well.
Thank you. In your testimony, you spoke to systemic risks and the tools we have in place to avoid them. Could you elaborate further on the nature of these systemic risks and the barriers to their mitigation?
Well, there's a number of risks. One of the critical functions of the markets and the other witnesses at the table is the system that we have of clearing. So when you put on a trade, the clearinghouse, your trade actually of the counterparties is assumed by the clearinghouse. So it's basically guaranteed, and we have a system of futures commission merchants that if you're a farmer and you want to trade and you want to hedge your crop on the exchange, you go to a futures commission merchant. The futures commission merchant will trade on the exchange. The futures commission merchant will post margin and then collect the margin from you, the farmer. So at the clearinghouse is all the funds deposited by the futures commission merchants and ultimately the customers, and it's guaranteed by the futures commission merchants, and that's been discussed also. So there's all the trades on the clearinghouse are guaranteed. Now, if in extreme market events, when people are stressed and there's a lot of stress in the system and possibly there might be adverse price movements that somebody might default on, that places stress on other members. And in times of extreme stress, when many people are stressed, then other people have to put up money for the defaulted trades, and that creates systemic risks because the system, somebody's got to pay for it. And if it's a very large market participant that fails, then other people have to put up a large amount of money for it. So those types of systemic risks in these extreme events where a lot of people are losing money and other people might have to cover the trades, those are the types of systemic risks that the regulatory system is concerned about and has all sorts of mechanisms to prevent those buildups and all sorts of mechanisms to ensure that there is trade on the performance, because the last thing you want is a domino effect where failure of one person means another person fails and their failure means another person, and that's a systemic failure. So we've built up a system that was strengthened by the Dodd-Frank Act to prevent those types of consecutive or multiple failures. But nonetheless, we're always looking at it and always looking for ways, because each time there's been a failure, each time there's been a systemic risk, it hasn't been anticipated before. So we're trying to anticipate the unanticipated and build robustness in the system, and always have to look and see whether it can be improved.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back a whole 6 seconds.
Thank you for your testimony, and I appreciate all the witnesses being here. Mr. Moore, I think you are up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Salmon, energy prices are important to families and businesses in my district. How have the disruptions from COVID and the Russian invasion impacted American energy policies? That's pretty broad.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes, that's pretty broad. So how has the war in Russia and COVID-19 impacted American energy prices? And you can talk about policy as well, but I'd like to hear your intake.
Yeah, so I'll take a stab at that. Chris, you can take a stab at that. We talk to customers every day about what rising prices, what rising interest rates, what change in value of the dollar means for our customers. There's so many ways in which U.S. economy and users and frankly the infrastructure is impacted by this. Number one, and certainly Mr. Edmonds will talk about this, with Russian crude oil and gas coming off the global market due to sanctions, that fundamentally has shifted the physical flows of crude oil. Now, the U.S. exported, I believe, a record 4.1 million barrels a day of U.S.-sourced WTI out of the U.S. just last month. Natural gas sourced here in the U.S. is being exported at record capacity right now, only limited by the LNG facilities to liquefy and ship that gas out to Europe and Asia, as that market has lost its ability to import piped gas from Russia. So you've got some structural shifts in the global energy market. You've got crude oil coming out of the Gulf and Saudi Arabia, which takes on a very vastly different, important impact given the fact that oil can't go from Russia into so many other sanctioned countries right now. So you've got a structural shift in energy markets. You've had a significant impact which initially drove energy prices up. Well, energy is an input cost to almost everything. We talked about the impact of fertilizer, the impact of farmers running diesel in your tractors, what we pay at the pump, what we pay at the store for bread. It's impacted almost everything. It's integrated into the risk that we engage in our lives. So that war has impacted taking 25% of the global wheat off the market. You got sunflower oil and rapeseed oil not coming out of the Black Sea. So it's impacted us in so many ways. The one thing that I would say is the biggest impact is the structural change in global flows of energy, particularly crude oil and natural gas. And as I think Mr. Edmonds mentioned before, there are some decisions around infrastructure here in the U.S. that will impact those decisions and what that looks like over time.
Yeah, input costs, no doubt. My cousin's trying to start. He's a young farmer, and he told me, I asked him, I said, how's it going, Garrett? And he said, well, I had budgeted for $3.31 a gallon diesel fuel when I was starting, and he said that certainly he's missed a number, had a great crop, but no profit at the bottom end. Mr. Edmonds, you want to touch on that? Any input that we missed on Mr. Salmon's?
Look, the input is the point that we've made. I mean, the margin, all of what Mr. Salmon just said creates volatility, margins go up. It's not just the clearinghouses that were represented here that are the margin. It's also the clearing members. The clearing members also, from time to time, based on their risk profile, maybe of your cousin, maybe of other participants that are out there, make their own credit decision, and they add on top of that. So as margins increase because of the general market volatility, so does the review the clearing members put on there. So there are constraints on that, but we have to react to what's out there, because what you don't want us is sitting in front of you explaining why we didn't execute our rule book, and there's been a large systemic issue that Mr. Berkovitz just explained in the previous question.
Mr. Edmonds, to follow up, I had a question I wanted to address to you. How can we best anticipate and manage emerging risks in cleared markets?
Well, we have to learn from our history. We have to make sure that our models take into consideration things that we have observed in the history. We also have to make sure that we're doing an appropriate level of discounting of some of those events that, because of regulatory changes, are unlikely to happen again. It's not zero, but instead of it happening every day and impacting the price of margin every single day, we might discount that because we learned from the past. We put that into the go-forward look at it, as Ms. Crichton referenced earlier. So we're not going to anticipate everything, but what we can do is be crystal clear of when something like that happens, how we're going to respond to it. And I think that becomes the most critical point of it, of how we responded to the unknown that is now coming and staring us in the face.
Thank you, Mr. Salmon. You want to follow up?
I'll just add one more thing. We've talked a lot about margin here today, and I think what we haven't differentiated is initial margin, which is the amount of collateral you put up to carry against taking on a derivative position, and variation margin. And to be very, very clear, if you look at the variation margin that flows, variation margin is the value that is exchanged between winning positions and losing positions every day. That's a daily mark-to-market. Now, in the CME Group exchanges, it's twice a day mark-to-market. So when we talk about margin going up, a portion of that, yes, is initial margin, where as volatility goes up, you would expect, as a prudential regulator, or the committee that oversees our prudential regulator, that we would require more collateral in the system, which is still a low percentage of face value of the overall contract value. But it's critical that we understand that variation margin, i.e. mark-to-market twice a day, every single position, eliminates and pulls that systemic risk out of the system. So enormous losses are not allowed to accrue. That's the danger of bilateral transactions. So we want to be very clear about initial margin. That's a conversation that we're willing to have, but the variation margin is that daily mark-to-market. You want us to be doing that every single day to make winners whole and make losers pony up more funds, to make sure they're making whole on the other side.
Thank you. I'm out of time, but I appreciate the panel being here. Y'all are one of the best I've heard in a while. Thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And the gentlelady from Connecticut, Representative Hayes, is up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I know that Chairman Thompson left, but I do want to note that I appreciated the way that he used his time in today's hearing. It was very helpful for me. Thank you, Ranking Member Scott, for holding this very important hearing, and to all the witnesses who are testifying today. A 2020 study by USDA's Economic Research Services found that small farms with less than $350,000 in gross cash farm income are less likely to use futures or option contracts in their businesses. Small farms account for 89% of the farms in the United States and 93% of the farms in my district in Connecticut. My district's small farms and dairies are particularly susceptible to market volatility and rely on robust and well-regulated commodity markets to keep their businesses afloat. But unfortunately, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the agency tasked with overseeing this activity, has not been fully authorized in over 10 years. Ms. Crichton, in your testimony, you pointed to international events which contributed to market volatility, like the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the volatility of nickel on the London Metals Exchange. You went on to mention several instances where CFTC led the way to risk controls and market transparency. In 2013, when the last long-term authorization of the CFTC lapsed, the Futures Industry Association submitted a letter to the Senate Agriculture Committee making recommendations for the reauthorization. In your view, has the CFTC had the necessary tools to be an effective global leader, and is a full reauthorization necessary to update their authority? And before you start your answer, just congratulations on being the lone woman on that panel.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the question. I'll answer it in two parts. One, for the topics that we've talked about today, we actually think the CFTC is fully authorized to interact on the topics and the issues that we've raised. Consistent with the letter that FIA filed in 2013, FIA fully supports the reauthorization of the CFTC. But thank you again for the question and the congratulations.
Thank you. Mr. Gelchi, what impact does global commodity volatility have on smaller producers that may not directly interact with futures or options contracts? And do you agree with properly updated practice? Do you agree that properly updated practices protect everyone in the agricultural sector?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. I think, firstly, to your point, in terms of small farmers' access to futures markets, that also is perhaps a service that Louis Dreyfus has provided to those farmers. To that point, I mean, I think some of the inputs that we get from small farmers is that hedging and/or having positions with FCMs is expensive, and it does require cash management. And from our standpoint, we feel that we have been essentially that shock absorber to that community.
Thank you. And I think that's why I noted my appreciation for Chairman Thompson's comments. Much of what we're talking about is very high level, but somebody's got to advocate for the little guy, and we have to make sure that the work that we are doing goes all the way down and reaches those 93% of farmers in my district. It looks like you want to Go ahead.
I just want to add a quick point, because this has been raised 2 or 3 times, and I've been remiss in not saying this before, but you make a really, really good point. There are a number of small ranchers and farmers out there that don't have access to the wholesale market. So one of the things we do, we try to meet the needs of all of our customers, especially farmers, ranchers, small family farmers. We've partnered with land-grant universities, agricultural trade associations, regional introducing brokers, those intermediaries, co-ops, to get education, training, understanding. We send our agricultural sales team out to 4-H Club and we're at every state fair to get the word out. It's such a dispersed group of users, so we have to go through not just our own channels, but sort of those institutional sales channels and access points to make sure that there's an understanding for these tools being available and how do we connect those end users. So it's a great point that I'm sorry I hadn't said it before, but I just didn't want to miss that opportunity to talk about the ways that we're using our own sales efforts to connect with those folks, to connect them with the markets.
You just said 4-H clubs. You are speaking my love language. But I really do appreciate that, because it is one of my priorities as we go into the next Farm Bill, to make sure that farmers at every level of the sector, all markets, get the benefit of the work that we do here, and that we are intentional in the way that we legislate to make sure that the impact is felt across the whole agricultural sector. I have another question. I have 3 seconds. I want to be a good student, so I'm going to submit it for the record and look forward to hearing a response to that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Hayes, and appreciate you being here with us today. Next up is Mr. Rose, Representative Mo Rose from Tennessee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Chairman Thompson and Ranking Member Scott, for holding this important hearing, and thanks to our witnesses for your valuable time today. Mr. Berkovitz, the U.S. is unique in that we have separate securities and derivatives regulators. Do you think that having separate regulators promotes market efficiencies?
Historically, the reason we have separate markets is because the commodity futures markets started in the agriculture, with agricultural commodities, and then securities market developed differently. I think the system we have here actually is very beneficial to our capital markets and promotes both our securities and our commodity markets. I've worked at both agencies. Both agencies are excellent agencies. Maybe if we were starting out historically, had a clean slate, you might put them both in the same agency. It would make sense from an academic point of view. But I think as things have developed and as they are now, I think the system is working very well. I think each agency is doing its mission, and I think that the separate CFTC, having a separate CFTC gives the prominence and attention to the derivative markets that it deserves, and the farm communities and the importance of these markets to the farmers and ranchers and agricultural sector is reflected in that there's an agency, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, whose mission is to ensure that their interests and the markets are fair and working for them. I think if you combine both agencies and add one big agency, that mission may not be as important as it is in the CFTC's mission right now. I think the proof is also in the pudding, is we have the strongest and most liquid and safest capital formation requirements globally, and we have the strongest, most liquid, most efficient price discovery and risk management markets in the world. This country and our markets are the leader globally, both on the derivative side, on the security side, and it's due both to the market participants, but it's also to the strength of the regulatory system. So I think our regulatory system is actually very effective and enabled this country to be a leader in all those markets.
Thank you. And I'm curious about the opinions of the other witnesses on the panel. So if you might just go from my left, your right, across, combined or separate? One-word answer.
I would agree with his statement.
Remain separate.
I would defer to Congress on that.
I'll go with separate.
All right. Thank you very much. One of the major themes of this hearing are the risks of black swan events to the global derivatives markets. I'd like to ask each of you, are there any unlikely but plausible black swan events that could pose a systemic risk to the global financial system that any of you are worried about but that have not yet been raised in this hearing today? And again, we'll start on the left and you can go across with the limited time we have.
Look, I would just say continued and increased geopolitical tensions.
Yeah, I'm not in the habit of being good about figuring out the unknown unknowns. However, I would say something that we haven't really talked about today is cyber risk, and that's something that I know that we all are cognizant of, and it's an industry body issue, it's an individual firm issue. Every one of us faces that at a personal level and a corporate level. So that's one that it's a known unknown, and I think that that's something that is systemically important to us, and I think we've got working groups across our industry as well as with the government as well to do the best we can to prepare for if and when that happens.
Two items I'll touch on. One is clearly cyber. I think Mr. Salmon said it well. The other is really the systemic risk that we think a large default or other market destabilizing event at a clearinghouse would have on the ecosystem at large. I referenced Mr. Berkowitz's comments as well in that regard. I think that's something that is worthy of more exploration and discussion.
We are going to say cyber, but I'm going to tell you that because of the global nature of our markets and the interconnectedness of the players in these markets that we have today, inconsistent regulation that's out of scope is a big unknown that you don't know how other regulators are going to react in a moment of stress.
I have other questions, but in view of the time remaining, I might just end by saying, I know by definition I'm asking you to think about the unknown unknowns, but I would just ask you all to go back and contemplate that and share with us anything that we might be missing that comes to mind. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and next up we have the gentleman from Georgia, Representative Bishop.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for tardiness in getting to the hearing. I want to again welcome the witnesses and thank you for your contribution to this very, very important discussion. Market volatility obviously is something that affects all of agricultural production and the products. And I'd just like to, as you talk about the risk management that accrues to all of our producers across the world, but particularly here in America, and as we lean into our preparation for the next Farm Bill, I'd like to ask each of you from your perspectives, and you, of course, at the high level, but as we focus on the Farm Bill and the safety net for American farmers and how the Farm Bill will ultimately impact the global market in agriculture, if you could just reflect quickly on what we need to really focus on in the Farm Bill in terms of the ag marketing service, risk management, farm credit, in order to have the safety net built into our Farm Bill and our preparations going forward. What do you think we need to make sure that we take into account from your perspective? Each of you, if you would.
I would thank you, Congressman. I would say firstly, support prices and stability in terms of again understanding what the rules look like in that Farm Bill. Right, that to me is the most important thing that we and that you can communicate in the Farm Bill.
I'll specifically talk about some of the pieces around the strengthening of the USDA. There are a number of reports and ways in which our grain markets, our livestock markets, and our dairy markets rely on reporting functions inside the USDA, so it's important that that continues to be robust and is funded to make sure that our markets that use those as inputs into settlement prices and the daily price settlement are continued to be funded and supported.
Thank you for the question. I think for us, from the clearing member perspective, given the importance of clear derivatives markets in risk management, price discovery, certainty of access to those risk management functions is critical. So ensuring capacity is available to farmers and users and ensuring the resilience and stability of exchanges and cleared markets.
I would say education. Making sure that there's a component within there that is educating the potential users of the product and those who use the product today. We all do what we can individually, but understanding how that goes within the policy objectives contained in the bill would be massively important.
Thank you, Congressman. And from my perspective, as someone who's worked with the CFTC and the Agriculture Committee for many years, and I'm just very encouraged by by the statements today by committee members about the importance of CFTC reauthorization. The CFTC can legally operate without it, but it is so important that you get its direction from Congress and any fine-tuning. When I was at the commission, we sent up a number of legislative proposals to fine-tune the Commodity Exchange Act. I leave it to the current CFTC as to whether they have any of those that they are going to propose, but to the extent they believe those would be helpful, that would be really helpful as well.
Thank you. And I'm not going to belabor the point, but I was interested to know from your perspectives what you thought we needed to do so that through the Farm Bill we could help to reduce the market volatility of which we've been discussing all day. So thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and next up we have the gentleman from New York, Representative Langworthy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for all of our witnesses for your testimony here today and taking the time to be with us. Global commodity markets play an important role in risk management on the farm, and whether it's producers using hedging or other risk management strategies directly or through their co-op or other input suppliers or buyers of the commodities that they produce, being able to mitigate the price risk for their inputs in what they produce is critically important given the tight margins in the volatile markets. Commodity price risk management is also important for our food processors and our manufacturers, and commodity markets are really the underpinning for these activities, so it's important that they're reliable and they're transparent. While beyond the scope of today's hearings, I really hope that what we've heard today will inform us as we move forward in our work on the Farm Bill for the next 5 years. And as we think of the future direction of the programs that can help producers mitigate the prices in the production risk. And with that, Mr. Salmon, one insurance product that provides price protection for some dairy farmers in my district is the Dairy Revenue Production product, which is linked to the futures price of the dairy products traded on the CME. Given that dairy doesn't have the history that grains and oil seeds have on the futures market or the volume traded, what is your long-term view of dairy products on the CME, and what can be done to ensure that it's a stable, reliable market to ensure that they can continue to play a part in risk management for dairy producers and dairy processors?
Yeah, no, terrific question, Mr. Congressman. Thank you for that. Dairy is an important part of our business. It's not the biggest part of our business. It's smaller than livestock, a lot smaller than grains and oilseeds, but it's still an important part of the service we provide. We continue to evolve the transparency, access, and price provision in dairy markets, whether it's in the cheese market or in any other parts of dairy milk, for example. We've actually migrated that price provision platform from what used to be a pit-traded platform now to a platform based on what's called Elysian technology within CME Group. So that is an auction process. So there's clear, open, transparent mechanism for setting that price, seeing that price. We work, as I mentioned before, to the question about what the Farm Bill could do, reauthorizing the USDA and making sure that that is robust so it connects to our dairy market, which have strongly expected setting the price of 85% of the price of cheese in the U.S. is based on our settlement price. So to the extent that it's an important part of our market, we continue to innovate and make it as transparent as possible. It's never going to be a market the size of even livestock, not to mention grains, oilseeds, or treasury bonds, but it is a critical component of price setting for the vast majority of cheese and dairy products that are sold in the U.S. So happy to go deeper with you and the groups that are looking for better understanding for how that auction process works, but we continue to evolve that, electronifying that process, bringing more people into that price provision process and disseminating those prices as quickly as possible creates that very transparency and I think market trust that is critical to enable dairy producers to operate profitably.
Thank you. Thank you. And in sticking with you, Mr. Salmon, how does crude oil and natural gas as an input price play a direct and indirect role as it relates to agriculture production?
It's probably one of the bigger, other than fertilizer, it's one of the biggest changes and impacts to the cost base of every farmer, every consumer in America, frankly. This has been a wild ride. Natural gas, I believe Mr. Edmonds mentioned before, 8 months ago we were knocking on the door of $9 an MMBTU here in U.S. natural gas, and now we're around $2.50, and with some downward pricing pressure. Now that was thanks largely to a very mild winter and well supplied going into what was a scary moment of losing Russian flows into Europe. But I think the increase and now decrease has a tail effect that's had whips on some folks, and that's hard. So markets can't mitigate all your risk, but market providers like CME Group and ICE can provide tools to help end users that are reliant on volatile pricing cost inputs to their business to at least mitigate or have price certainty around those things. And it's just been hard for everybody, and it's impacted the farmers themselves very drastically.
Well, having had the opportunity to spend time in the district, traveling to, our farms in western New York and the southern tier counties along the Pennsylvania line, they're feeling those high prices, whether it be from, rubber or fuel prices or, transporting feed, operating farms. I mean, these things can't be any higher, and we have to do everything we can to get things under control. But I really thank you very much for your testimony, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the next individual we have is Representative Nunn from Iowa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it. Thank you very much for providing your testimony today and spending some time with the Ag Committee. This is going to be an exciting year for the Farm Bill. This is a bipartisan effort to really drive home where we can find relation on the Farm Bill and ideally move forward a Farm Bill that will help all of our producers across the country. I represent Iowa's 3rd Congressional District, and we are proud to be the home of one of the leading producers of corn, soybean, egg, pork, and I'm a sheep farming family, so a little bit of that as well. With respect to corn specifically in 2022, Iowa produced roughly 2.4 billion bushels, and this is seen as the nation's most valuable crop going forward. As each of you know, our farmers have faced several years of skyrocketing input costs, both to the grower, to the producer, and ultimately to families like mine with 5 girls and 1 13-year-old boy that really make things expensive. The global market volatility, the lack of competition, the consolidation, supply chain disruptions, an ongoing war in Eastern Europe, and the continued placement of increased strains on our producers that feed and fuel the world has taken a toll. You've mentioned this before, and so, Mr. Solomon, I'd like to begin with you. As we move deeper into our Farm Bill discussions this year, what can Congress do to ensure that farmers have access to the tools that best protect them from a volatile commodities market and price risks? And further, how might our producers best access and utilize future markets for the purpose to manage these risks?
So great question. I think we've touched on this a little bit in different pieces, and this is why it's important that as an industry we come before you, because we represent kind of the full ecosystem here: clearinghouses, exchanges, industry bodies, end users. Right. And I think that it's relative to the Farm Bill piece. I mentioned some of the specifics, very granular on the USDA side. There are so many ways in which we are dependent on a fully functioning Farm Bill to make sure that our processes work and create transparency and hedging tools available to all producers and end users. I think Mr. Edmonds made a really good point, and I touched on this before. Education and access. CME Group has 3,600 employees globally. We don't have enough to canvass every single co-op across the U.S., so we rely on intermediaries, regional co-ops, and introducing brokers. As I mentioned, I'm not kidding, we canvass state farms and we do 4-H clubs and we hand out ribbons for prize heifers and things like that to make sure that people understand, there's a connection between family farms and setting the wholesale price of that particular commodity, whether it's livestock, whether it's dairy, whether it's grain. So, we can't do that alone. We're simply not big enough. So we work through partnerships of intermediaries, introducing brokers that are not clearing members. They themselves use clearing members to get access to our markets. So it's a long chain of access and education. So I just, again, come back to the point that Mr. Edmonds said. It is very much down to educating people on both the benefits of hedging. And I think this is a case study of the last 2 years of why hedging can help manage some of these costs. Number 2, how you access these markets, what it means to you. Even if you're not a direct consumer of trading futures and options on derivatives exchanges, how you can benefit from the transparency of standardized pricing so you know what your crop is worth because you've got some basis differential to a standardized crop. All of those pieces matter, and I think education, access is things that we work at but we can't do alone. So anyway, we would welcome a discussion where we could use that Farm Bill reauthorization and get that through to say we need troops of folks to go out there and educate and train and create more access. We would love to be a part of that conversation.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Ms. Creighton, for you, according to a recent survey by the Committee on Payments and Market Infrastructure, roughly 20% of our clearinghouses provide tools for end users to estimate how their margin requirements might change during the period of market volatility. So staying on the same theme, can you walk us through the possible solutions clearinghouses can take to enhance transparency of margins required for farmers, ranchers, and others to better help us prepare for future stress events?
Sure. Thank you. Great question. Again, I think we talked a bit about this before, but I think to add a few points to the overall discussion, we think there are tools that certain exchanges and CCPs have that they provide to end users and customers to be able to model their margin. We think part of the benefit of what we can do on the forward is to be able to provide tools and more transparency about what happens during extremely volatile markets, right? How do margins move in order to be able to help them project what their funding needs are. That's how we think about when we risk manage our clients directly. We spend a lot of time educating them on what our risk models do, how they react during certain stresses so they can appropriately understand what are the guardrails and what is the funding that they need on hand to be able to adequately prepare for that. So I think web-based tools, interaction, and preparing clearing members and providing us with access to that information so we can then further educate clients, I think will be an important way to leverage the ecosystem and to be able to provide that education back.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much for being here today. Hope your farming season goes well. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back my time.
closing, and then we'll come back to members. All right, the ranking member has a urgent conflict here, so I'm going to ask him, we're going to kind of jump ahead, and then we'll come back to members. Recognize the ranking member for a closing statement.
Yes, and first, thank you, Chairman, for giving me this opportunity. We have a group of veteran organizations waiting on me, and we're putting together a great event to help our veterans who need help getting food and shelter. And so this is very important. Thank you so much, Chairman. I did not want to leave without saying thank you and let you know just how important your testimony has been. And I thank you, Chairman, for pulling this group together. They are very knowledgeable. Your insights have been brilliant. And you've opened many of our eyes, because we have newer members on, to aspects of derivatives, our cross-border, and this burgeoning area. As I say to people and remind them, we're dealing with $810 trillion of the world's economy in our hands when we're dealing with derivatives and our swaps, and using this as very much needed balancing act for risk and management within a world that's full of surprise elements every day, every moment. Who would have thought that Putin and Russia would invade Ukraine? And who would have thought, and we are so grateful, that Ukraine has had the willingness and determination to stand and fight back. But it has caused tremendous risk and tremendous challenges for our agriculture industry and the important role that derivatives and swaps played in it. So I want to thank you, and please know that as we move forward with this Farm Bill, there may be some things that you can help us with. We want to receive that help because you all have a wealth of experience. And this is a very technical area. It is not one that is often plainly seen. So we need experts like you. I've worked with several of you for 20 years on CFT, Chairman, and others, and ICE, and we also have Mr. Michael Jelsey, Group Chief Executive Officer of the Lewis Drivers Company, Mr. Derek Salmon, Senior Manager, Director, Global Head of Commodities, Options, and International Markets, the CME Group. And make sure you tell your Chief Executive, Mr. Terrence, I said hello. He's a good man. Terrence Duffy, longtime friend. Miss Alicia Crichton, let me join with the others. And it's very important that all of our women members pointed out this historic moment. But let me also bring that congratulations to you from deep in my heart, because for you to be the first woman on this burgeoning committee is very, very important. Mr. Christopher Edmonds, Chief Executive Officer of ICE, another good partner. We've been together for over 21 years, working with different things. And to you, Mr. Dan Berkovitz, former Commissioner, Commodities Future Trading Commission, you heard this committee say, and the chairman, we are going to finally reauthorize the CFTC. And both sides of the aisle here are committed to getting that done. And we're going to do it. Thank you for your participation. God bless each and every one of you. And again, as I said, we have an open heart, an open mind, and open arms to receive your help with these challenges and the technical, scientific progress we're dealing with in agriculture. Thank you.
Well, I thank the ranking member and his partnership. Now I'm pleased to recognize the gentleman from Indiana, Dr. Baird, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, you know, I really appreciate you and the ranking member putting together this committee and this hearing. And I also appreciate, you know, I'm always impressed with the knowledge and the expertise that you as witnesses bring to this committee and how important that is. And so I just want to say thank you for that. And then I only have, since I'm getting toward the end of the questioning period, I only got a couple of 3 questions that may be a little different. So I'll try to be brief because I'm sure you're getting tired of answering questions. So my first one goes to Mr. Gelching, and it deals with, in a little different area. You mentioned the limited availability of U.S. dollar currency exchanges. Can you expand on that point just a little and tell us?
Sure, Congressman, thank you. You know, referring to the continued rate increases in the United States, we've continued to see currency fluctuations globally. Many of our customers in countries overseas have had difficulties opening up letters of credit recently, and as a result of having a lack of access to dollars as a function of their own currencies devaluing against the U.S. dollar, and that's created a bit of a concern relative to our ability to supply our customers, but also for their ability to buy the grains that ultimately they need to feed their people.
Thank you. Mr. Sandman, you mentioned a number of tools that are used by the exchange to maintain orderly markets, which I think is very important, including margin add-ons, price limits, circuit breakers, and velocity logic. Would you care to elaborate on that? Because they're relatively new terms to me.
Yeah, I'll just touch on a couple of those. Position limits we talked about a little bit earlier, really important that we talk about the need to make sure that if you're an underlying hedger and you've got a core exposure to an asset, whether it's a treasury bond or a kilo gold bar or a bushel of corn, end users and those folks have larger position limits when they can prove that they've got offsetting physical exposures. We have smaller position limits for speculators for the obvious reasons that we don't want them to be outsized proportion. So that's an important kind of mechanism we use to make sure concentration risk on our market is appropriate. Daily price limits in enumerated commodities, and those are primarily the ags products here that have hard position limits. So as you know, wheat, corn, and beans can only move so much until they freeze on a day. They can go limit up multiple days, and we have mechanisms in place when they reopen safely, and everyone knows deterministically how they will reopen. That's important. You've heard again and again here. We have mechanisms in markets that don't have hard position limits. We utilize a mechanism called velocity logic, which, as I said earlier, inhibits markets from moving too far too fast. For every market, there's a specific amount that a market can move in a specified time period, and if it exceeds that, our markets freeze for a specified time period. If it happens again, it freezes again for, again, a predetermined specified time period, so people know how to expect markets to react if they start to run, as it were. The other things we talked about, the twice daily variation, margin run, circuit breakers, really a version of velocity logic. And you heard a lot of talk around margin levels and proactively managing those as more instability comes into the market. You'd expect clearing houses, and in some cases, to the point that was made earlier, top-ups by the clearing firms themselves on top of exchange minimums minimums. It's just the way that the market is able to try to anticipate the volatility and making sure there's enough collateral in the system to do exactly what mutualized risk does, and that's ensure that nobody loses money in a mutualized risk model. So hopefully that gives you some flavor for what I talked about.
Very good, and thank you. And I've got about 35 seconds left. So, Ms. Creighton, you mentioned, I know we've talked a lot about margins and the fluctuation in margins and so on. So could you share your concern about how these large and fluctuating margin calls may be driving some commodity firms away from doing hedging, which is important to ranchers and farmers?
Yeah, we think these large fluctuations can create a destabilizing effect. When these large swings in margin happen, and as Mr. Salmon mentioned, we would expect that margin rates rise when volatility increases. But we think the starting off point for margin levels tends to be too low, particularly in times of low volatility. So the natural course, we expect margin levels to rise and increase. The problem is when we see such pronounced swings, we think that's destabilizing. It drives a number of members and a number of end users and clients to have to seek short-term, highly liquid assets to be able to post to their clearing members, for them to post onwards to the clearinghouse. We think the cost of doing that can rise significantly, particularly in times of high stress, which is when we least want to see those types of stresses add to the burdens of risk management.
Thank you, and I'm out of time, except that I would like to say that Mr. Edmonds and Mr. Berkowitz, I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to ask you a question, so thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I appreciate gentlemen, and gentleman yields back. Now, please recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Molinaro, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Edmonds and Mr. Berkowitz, I don't have questions for you either, so I feel badly. But I also feel a little bit out of sorts going after the ranking members' closing comments. Ms. Creighton, could you just explain a little bit more, maybe go a little bit further down you speak about increasing the margin floors to ease some of those volatilities. Can you just explain that to let's say to the average American as to how that will help reduce risk?
Sure. So I guess we think about it in a couple of different ways, and I guess one of the examples that I'll use is when we think about the size of initial margin and drawing the distinction that Mr. Salmon drew earlier of initial margin and variation margin. When we think about the size of initial margin, what we're really trying to do is ensure that it's adequate to cover the risks in the market. In futures markets in the U.S., that means that it's sized to a one-day, it's intended to cover one-day price move, right? When we see that we have large P&L swings, large mark-to-market, that typically is then followed by a large increase in initial margin. So what we're trying to say is rather than allowing margin levels to go so low that when shocks do happen, they have to increase so much to substantially cover for that risk, which creates stress on clients and end users, and in certain parts clearing members as well, that we want to kind of increase that floor so margin levels can't go as low as we've seen them go in times of low volatility. We think it actually artificially masks costs to clients and end users. They think they can fund here, but where they actually need to be funding is for the eventuality of needing to post margin at these levels. And that difference can create a lot of stress. So we're not saying that we want to, sorry to add one more point. No, go ahead. We don't want to just unilaterally increase margin. We're not trying to cover all risk, but we think there's a better balance than what we've been seeing, and that stability and predictability is better for all end users and clients here.
That was something even I can understand, so I appreciate that very much. Mr. Salmon, I wanted to return to my colleague, Mr. Nunn's question. You spoke a little bit about the need for greater education access. Could you point to some of the more effective tools? Listen, I'm very appreciative of being at the county or state fair and handing out ribbons, but why don't you speak to some of the more effective education tools and how we might embed that in the Farm Bill?
Sure. Great question. So we, as I mentioned before, we work with a lot of land-grant universities. We work with various schools that actually have agricultural departments. We run a global trading challenge for universities, not just in the U.S., but globally, where we actually create a trading challenge and allow customers and students that are trying to understand these markets and how they operate to compete to sort of a fictitious set of market circumstances. They can interact with these markets and understand the power of the tools, the capabilities of what derivatives markets make available to them. So we would love to partner with somewhere in the Farm Bill to extend our reach out into via co-ops, and introducing brokers in these rural communities are so important. There's just not enough of them. So those are folks that are connecting individual farms to co-ops and co-ops to wholesale markets to at least get access to the price so they know what their crop is worth, and at best be able to have access, via those intermediaries into some sort of hedging tool of some sort. So would love to be a part of that discussion. If that's part of the Farm Bill, I think that would go a long way to addressing a lot of the questions we heard about today that, single farms or small farms are getting crowded out of that space. I do want to come back just to a moment on the margin piece, and I think as we talk about elevating margins, we should be clear, our contracts right now have a floor margin level. We could debate whether that's too high or too low, but just to be clear, there is a floor under which, margins don't drop. And I think the other piece is there's certainly a danger, and I think Ms. Crichton has pointed out a danger being margins too low. I think there's absolutely a danger in the worst case scenario, margin being too high. And I spoke at a BIS symposium on Tuesday morning with global central banks on this very topic, where there were 3 of the world's largest energy producers represented, and they said margins went so high and margin top-ups by clearing firms were multiples of the clearing exchange minimums that it forced them into the OTC market. That is the other ditch you want to avoid. So I just want to make sure that we're talking about a balanced view here, that no one would disagree that too low margins is not good, but there is a real danger that the worst case scenario is the margins that are too high end up pushing people into unregulated bilateral markets. Now you've got opacity in a market that was once transparent. So I just want to be clear that there's a risk at both ends of that.
I appreciate that, and I would say from the education perspective, even reaching to K-12, future farmers, really investing early on to create that understanding as certainly smaller farms, family farms transition. Mr. Chairman, I very much wanted to ask Mr. Gelchi a question, but I've run out of time, and so I'll just save it for another.
Gentleman's yielded some more time. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the last hearing. He did take a whole minute away from us, so I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gelchi, I just wanted to give you an opportunity, really, to speak more broadly and briefly to what you foresee from your perspective, the biggest risks and opportunities for American agriculture. In the immediacy, as we develop this farm bill, what would you point to as the thing we need to pay attention to sustain American agriculture?
Sure. No, thank you. I think, as we had mentioned earlier, consistency, clarity in terms of what support prices might look like for the farmer. That, I think, is extremely important. We've talked about the inputs and the rising costs for fertilizer, land, and so these are I think criteria that I would pay a particular attention to in relation to the upcoming Farm Bill.
Thank you, and thanks for the courtesy, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Well, I thank the gentleman for reminding me I cut his time last time. And great job. Well done. Hey, I want to thank all our witnesses as we close here, just to say thank you for bringing your expertise to the table. We have 5 talented individuals, have tremendous experience and insight, and we benefited from that today. I want to thank our members, all of our members, for the participation and, quite frankly, the insightful questions that were generated. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say a great big thank you to all of our, if I didn't recognize Mr. Duarte for Well, let me do my last thank you, and then I'll come back and finish my closing when we actually close. And that's to the staff, staff, all of our staff that work so hard, the staff in the personal offices, certainly the staff on our committees that staff us, that we absolutely could not do our jobs without them. And so I am pleased to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Duarte, for 5 minutes.
You're a tolerant and thoughtful leader, GT. Thank you. Thank you to the chair. Sorry, lunch awaits you. I'm from California. I'm from a farming district in California. It goes from Modesto down to Fresno. And there's a large, not a large one, but there's a budding movement in California to consolidate water rights down to the Delta. And then there are some who think that securitizing or monetizing and securitizing water rights and putting them on perhaps one of the boards of trade that you govern or participate in would be a good idea. I don't think it's a good idea. I think that commodities are commodities. They move around the globe and they fill voids and shortages through a free market system that you folks would help facilitate. But water is not a commodity. Water is local, water is constrained within its basins, and it does not have global movement, and we cannot always make more of it when the market demands that we might want to. Could you please, any of you, comment on how you see the limitations of water trading or how you see the opportunities of water trading and what we should be concerned about or open to in terms of opportunities when it comes to such?
So I'll comment because we list a contract that's not ours, but we list a contract that is a NASDAQ contract that is a cash-settled water index. I think it's based with the Velas index, as I recall. That listed probably 2+ years ago. It's an index cash-settled for the idea that NASDAQ believed, and we're just a listing agent for them, so it can trade on our exchange. And I believe their thought was that there would be an interest for folks looking to get some sort of economic exposure. You're absolutely right. Water is not a physical product. It's uneconomical to, transport the way you can crude oil or natural gas or corn or gold for that matter. So it has had a high degree of intellectual interest. It's had very little traction economically in terms of very little pickup on that. And I think there is a broadening discussion around, how that should be treated. So I would probably point you to reach out to NASDAQ on that contract since we're just the listing agent. But I just want to make sure that the commission knew that there was a product. So I'd point you to NASDAQ to have a further conversation on that product.
Thank you. Any other comments? Please, Mr. Berkowitz.
I would just comment that from the perspective of the CFTC, I'm not speaking for the CFTC in this capacity, but from the derivatives markets, in terms of a derivatives contract, should anybody want to list them, until about the year 2000, the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, the CFTC would look at what's the hedging utility, what's the utility of these contracts. But since 2000, the change in the law, the CFTC just looks at the integrity of the contract and doesn't pass upon the value, so to speak, of the economic use. It's basically up to the market to decide. So the CFTC, were it asked to approve a contract, would pass upon the integrity of the contract, is it susceptible to manipulation, but would not look at, is this a good thing or a bad thing?
Thank you. That is one of my concerns, is the manipulation. Somebody from far away, outside our basin, outside our community, outside our state, outside our country, could play the water market through political or environmental manipulations, create scarcity, and increase the value of their securitized water interests. And that, I feel, is a huge vulnerability this would bring to my district and to many urban and rural water users.
And if an exchange were to list one of those contracts, by law, the contract would be required to be not susceptible to manipulation. The exchange would have to have mechanisms in place, and the CFTC would review those before the contract could be approved.
I'd only point to, just so you know, you may not be aware or may be aware, there is, in Australia, there is a water contract, and I believe it is physical. I think that is probably set up within 5 or 8 years ago, and there have been some challenges with that. So there is a case study as somebody trying to do it as a deliverable contract, and it got into the questions that you'd wonder. Where's their financial interest? Where's an end-user consumer interest, and are those in balance with one another? So not passing judgment, good or bad, but it's a case study, and I think if you wanted to talk to your constituents about that, that's probably a good place to start.
Thank you. I've got 53 seconds left. Any of you wise folks have any more wisdom for me? Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll get out of the way of lunch. Well,
I thank the gentleman. Lunch is over, though, We're well beyond that. Once again, all the thanks that I've offered already. My closing statement, it really is helpful to understand how market participants, intermediaries, and regulators work together to ensure the markets operate efficiently and effectively. Sustaining deep and vibrant derivatives markets often requires compromises between the views of different actors. I appreciate having having heard more about those points of view today. This hearing provided insight on how the industry works to reconcile the different points of views that you all have. What processes, formal or informal, are in place to help industry participants and regulators alike work through those ideas. What we heard today, I believe, will better prepare us to perform our oversight duties for the derivatives market. And so with that, under the rules of the committee, the record of today's hearing will remain open for 10 calendar days to receive additional materials and supplementary written responses from witnesses to any questions posed by a member. This hearing of the Committee on Agriculture is adjourned.